5 days before Christmas, my 11-year-old daughter collapsed beside my parents' staircase, doubled over in pain and too weak to stand. Minutes later, I was riding beside her ambulance, while my car and keys stayed behind at their house. By Christmas morning, Ellie had survived emergency treatment and was finally being wheeled toward the hospital's glass front discharge lobby. She was pale, exhausted, but going home. I messaged our family for one simple thing: a ride. Everyone saw it. Nobody answered. Nearly an hour later, Mom finally wrote, "Stop turning her discharge into a family event. She survived. That should be enough." Ellie read the message over my shoulder and whispered, "Mom, am I not family?" That was when I stopped making excuses for them and made one call they never expected. Before I tell you how one request for a ride changed everything I thought I understood about my family, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me to the end, and if stories like this mean something to you, I'd be glad to have you subscribe and come back for the next one. 5 days earlier, I had been standing in my parents' front hallway with one glove on when Ellie doubled over so suddenly that for a second I thought she had dropped something. It was December 20th, late afternoon, and Mom had spent most of the day turning the house into the Christmas headquarters it had been for as long as I could remember. There were cinnamon candles burning in the kitchen, boxes of ornaments under the stairs, wrapping paper spread across the dining room table, and a ceramic Santa on the entry console beside my car keys. Ellie had been quieter than usual through lunch. She said her stomach hurt, but at 11, stomachaches can mean anything from illness to too much hot chocolate to not wanting to admit that your cousin beat you at a board game. I had watched her more closely once she stopped teasing my father about his crooked tree lights. By 4 o'clock, her face had gone pale enough that I stopped making excuses for it. Then she folded in half beside the staircase. Everything after that happened with the strange speed emergencies have. My father moved a chair out of the way. Mom brought a dish towel for no reason I could understand. I knelt beside Ellie and touched her forehead while she tried not to cry. By the time the paramedics arrived, there was no debate about whether we were going to the hospital. They transferred her onto a stretcher, and I climbed into the ambulance without thinking about anything except staying where she could see me. My car remained in my parents' driveway. My keys remained on the console beside the ceramic Santa. At the hospital, complicated appendicitis replaced Christmas as the only phrase that mattered. What followed was several days measured less by dates than by nurses. Changing shifts, IV bags emptying, doctors checking her abdomen, and Ellie asking when she could go home. She was treated urgently and then kept in for antibiotics and observation. I learned how little sleep a person actually needs when the alternative is closing her eyes while her child is hurting. My family had not vanished during those days, which was exactly why I did not recognize what was coming. Mom and Dad stayed for part of that first night. Dad later brought my purse, phone charger, a change of clothes, and a few essentials. Heather dropped off food once and told Ellie that Chloe had been asking about her. Greg sent brief check-ins. They had cared enough to be present in small ways, and I mistook that for proof they would be there when we needed one ordinary thing. Dad had also told me not to worry about my car. When discharge day came, he said, somebody would bring it over or come get us. It had been such an ordinary promise that I never thought to arrange anything else. 25 minutes across suburban Columbus was not a rescue mission. It was a ride. By Christmas Eve, Yeli could sit up longer without turning gray around the mouth. She ate a little. She complained about hospital mashed potatoes, which was the first thing she had complained about in days, and therefore one of the sweetest sounds I had heard all week. The hospital had tried to make Christmas visible without pretending anyone wanted to spend it there. Paper snowflakes had been taped to doors. A small artificial tree stood near the nurse's station. Somebody had tied a red bow around the sanitizer dispenser outside Ellie's room. That night, she asked whether Grandma would save her some of the cinnamon rolls she always made on Christmas morning. Of course she will, I told her. I said it automatically. I had become very good at automatic reassurance. After Ben died in 2020, when Ellie was only 5, I developed a private terror of subtraction. She had lost her father. I could not change that, but I could make sure she still had grandparents and cousins, and an aunt and an uncle. I could preserve Sunday dinners and birthdays, and Christmas mornings at the house where I had grown up. I could keep the rest of her world from becoming smaller. So if Mom skipped something because parking was difficult, I explained parking. If she left early because she was tired, I explained her age. If a school event fell on an inconvenient evening, I explained schedules. Ellie had already learned not to count on Grandma for every ordinary event, but neither of us had ever translated that into anything as serious as not belonging. Grandma was Grandma. The family house was the family house. Christmas was Christmas. Those things had seemed permanent. On Christmas morning, a doctor cleared Ellie to go home. I felt relief before I felt anything else. Not dramatic movie scene relief. It was physical. My shoulders dropped. My jaw hurt when I realized how hard I had been clenching it. I packed slowly because Ellie was still sore and tired. A nurse reviewed the essentials with me, and I tucked the discharge paperwork into my bag without turning the moment into another medical event. The dangerous part was behind us. What Ellie needed now was rest, simple food, her own bed, and time. She changed into loose sweatpants and a sweatshirt I had brought from home. Pulling the sweatshirt over her head left her breathing harder than it should have, and she sat on the edge of the bed afterward with both hands resting in her lap. "Home?" she asked. Home. That was all either of us needed. The nurse found a wheelchair, and we made our slow way toward the discharge lobby. Beyond the glass, the sky was the flat, gray-white Columbus often gets in December, cold without committing to picturesque snow. Cars moved through the covered pickup lane one by one. Families came in bundled in coats and left carrying bags, flowers, paperwork, sometimes babies. I pulled out my phone. At 9:17 that morning, I wrote in our Messenger family thread, "Can anyone come pick us up?" There were only 5 people in that thread. Me, Mom, Dad, Heather, and Greg. There was no giant extended family audience, no cousins twice removed, no reason for anyone to assume I was asking somebody else. I watched the scene indicators appear. Dad saw it first, then Heather, Greg, Mom. For the first few minutes, I did what I always did and supplied explanations before anyone had asked me to. Dad was probably helping Mom with breakfast. Heather had 2 children. Greg had his son. Christmas morning was chaotic. 10 minutes became 30 while a nurse brought Ellie a warmed blanket and told us we could stay in the heated lobby. I kept checking the thread. Ellie noticed. "Grandpa coming?" "I'm sure they're figuring it out." The sentence left my mouth easily because I had practiced versions of it for years. They're figuring it out. Grandma probably forgot. Aunt Heather has a lot going on. Uncle Greg thought it was next week. Nobody means anything by it. At 30 minutes, I checked rideshare prices. Cars were available, though the holiday wait was longer than usual. The hospital also had transportation options they could help arrange. But none of that was the point yet. Dad had my car. My parents lived 20-some minutes away. 4 adults had seen the request. I was still expecting one of them to move. Ellie shifted carefully in the wheelchair and stared through the glass doors. Every time headlights swung into the pickup lane, her eyes lifted. Once, it was a minivan. Once a silver SUV. Once, a man in a red Ohio State jacket who hurried through the doors carrying flowers. None of them were ours. At 40 minutes, my thumb hovered over Dad's name. Then I stopped. 4 adults had already seen the same uncomplicated request. I was not asking anyone to cancel Christmas or take over Ellie's recovery. I needed somebody to drive a car for 25 minutes. At 58 minutes, Messenger changed. Mom was typing. For one absurd second, relief came first. I pictured Dad already looking for his coat. Maybe Heather had offered. Maybe Greg was closest. Maybe Mom was about to tell me who was on the way. Then her message appeared. Stop turning her discharge into a family event. She survived. That should be enough. I read it once. Then again. The words did not get better the second time. There are sentences that hurt because they are shouted. Others hurt because they are precise. Mom's sentence was precise. It turned Ellie surviving into the reason nobody should have to show up now. As though concern had a cutoff point. As though once a doctor said discharge, every obligation expired. Below Mom's message, there was nothing from Heather. Nothing from Greg. Nothing from Dad. I became aware of the fluorescent lights reflecting in the glass. The wheels of a cart squeaked somewhere behind us. A volunteer in a Christmas sweater was speaking softly to an elderly couple near the elevators. All those ordinary sounds seemed unnaturally clear. I locked my phone. That should have been enough, but Ellie had been sitting close enough to see. She had always been quick with screens, quicker than I wanted sometimes. I saw her eyes lower toward my hand before I could turn the phone away. Her face did not crumple. That would almost have been easier. She just looked at the dark screen for a few seconds. Then she asked, very quietly, Mom, am I not family? The answer came to my mouth before thought did. Of course you are. Grandma didn't mean I stopped. That unfinished sentence frightened me more than anything else that morning. For 6 years, since Ben died, I had been building bridges between what my family did and what I wanted Ellie to believe it meant. Mom hated hospitals. Dad hated conflict. Heather had young children. Greg was scattered. Christmas was busy. There was always a softer interpretation available if I worked hard enough. But my daughter had just spent 5 days in a hospital. She was wrapped in a warmed blanket in a wheelchair 25 minutes from people who called themselves her family. 4 adults had read a request for a ride. Not one had answered yes. There was no kind translation that would not require me to lie to her. I put my phone in my bag and crouched beside the wheelchair carefully enough not to jar her legs. You are my family, I said. I could give her that much without explaining anyone else. She nodded once. Then she looked back through the glass. The next few minutes were when something inside me changed, though at the time it did not feel dramatic. It felt practical. The hospital could arrange transportation if we waited. I could keep refreshing rideshare apps. I could call people from work, though I hated the thought of dragging a coworker away from Christmas for a problem my own family had chosen not to solve. Then I thought of the woman who lived 2 doors down from me. Dottie Klein was 71, retired from managing a school cafeteria, and capable of turning a 30-second trip to the mailbox into a 14-minute conversation about recycling pickup, somebody's loose gutter, and whether grocery stores deliberately moved the cranberry sauce every year to punish older people. We were friendly. We were not call on Christmas morning friendly. At least, I had not thought we were. I stared at her name for several seconds before pressing call. When she answered, I immediately began apologizing. I told her Ellie had been discharged, that my ride had fallen through, that I knew it was Christmas, and that if she had family over or, which entrance? I stopped. Dottie repeated the question. Not impatiently exactly, but with the tone of someone trying to get the useful piece of information, while another person insisted on decorating it. I told her. She said she was putting on shoes and disconnected before I could apologize again. I sat there holding the phone. Ellie looked at me. Mrs. Klein? I nodded. She talks a lot. Despite everything, the corner of Ellie's mouth moved. Yeah, I said. She does. Dottie arrived 28 minutes later in the same compact crossover she had owned for years. There was an umbrella on the back floor, a grocery bag behind the passenger seat, 2 reusable shopping totes folded badly enough to be useless, and a cardboard box that appeared to contain Christmas decorations she had never taken inside. She lowered the window before I reached the car, and informed me that whoever designed the hospital entrance had apparently held a personal grudge against people who needed to pick anyone up. That was her entire reaction. She did not ask for a family history or perform goodness for us. She simply made room in the car. She cleared the passenger seat by moving a stack of coupons and a scarf, then fussed over the heat because Ellie looked cold. She produced a sleeve of crackers from somewhere near the center console, discovered they were slightly crushed, offered them anyway, and spent most of the drive telling us about a disastrous attempt to carry a pecan pie across her sister's icy porch years earlier. Ellie listened with her head resting against the seat. Halfway home, she ate one cracker, then another. By the time we turned onto our street, she had corrected one of Dottie's details, because Dottie had apparently told her the same pie story before. Dottie acted offended for approximately 6 seconds, and then kept talking. I watched Ellie in the mirror. Her face was still tired. The hospital pallor had not disappeared. But the tight little stillness that had settled over her in the lobby had loosened. There was something almost painful about how ordinary the ride was. That was all we had needed. An ordinary ride. At home, Dottie insisted on carrying one light bag even though I told her I had it. Then she remembered she had left something thawing in her kitchen. Announced that this was how people accidentally poisoned themselves on holidays, and went back down the sidewalk before I could thank her properly. I got Ellie settled on the couch with pillows, water, her blanket, and something bland she could tolerate. She fell asleep with the television on low, one hand curled near her face. Only then did I sit at the kitchen table and open Messenger again. The thread had grown. There were still no apologies or explanations, and Mom's sentence sat exactly where she had written it. I had already caught myself softening it. She was stressed. The crisis was over. Ellie was safe. For once, I stopped translating my mother. I pressed on the message, took one screenshot, and saved it. I did not save it to show anyone or turn it into evidence. I saved it because I knew myself. Given enough time, I could sand the edges off almost anything until the whole family fit comfortably around the same table again. I did not want to forget the exact words Ellie had read. Then I typed one reply. "Merry Christmas. The Realtor will explain the rest." I sent it before I could rewrite it into something gentler. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the typing bubbles appeared. Mom, Heather, Mom again, Greg. I did not open any of them. I silenced the thread. That was the first part they did not understand. They expected anger from me to behave like every other family dispute, flare, exhaust itself, become uncomfortable, then be cleaned up before the next gathering. They expected me to explain myself until my explanation could be argued with. I had spent years doing exactly that. That afternoon, I did something else. After Ellie woke, managed a little food, and settled again upstairs, I opened my contacts and found Nina Feldman. Nina was a local realtor I had worked with before. Mom's message and Ellie's question stayed out of the conversation because neither had anything to do with Nina's job. I simply sent a professional request. I wanted a current market evaluation on a property. I wanted her to contact the occupants the next morning to arrange access at a reasonable time. I was not asking her to list it that night. I was not telling anyone to leave immediately. There would be agreements to respect and decisions to make carefully. I knew that. But for the first time in 5 years, I had stopped thinking of that house only as Mom and Dad's house. I had started treating it as something over which I still had a decision to make. Nina replied that she would call me in the morning. I put my phone face down. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the furnace and the occasional sound of Ellie turning upstairs. Christmas evening had arrived without cinnamon rolls, without the long dining table, without cousins tearing wrapping paper, without Mom reminding everybody when dinner would be served. The silence did not feel empty so much as unfamiliar. Before I went to bed, I checked my phone one last time. Dad had called once. Mom had called again and again, enough times that her name filled most of the recent call screen. I did not answer either of them. I placed the phone on my nightstand, walked down the hall, and stood for a moment in Ellie's doorway. She was asleep on her side beneath the blanket, home at last, one small lamp throwing a warm circle across the room. That morning she had asked me whether she was family. I still did not know what I was going to do with all the answers that question had opened. But I knew one thing. By morning, Mom would hear a word I had avoided using around her for 5 years. The first thing I heard the morning after Christmas was my phone vibrating against the wood of the nightstand. I opened my eyes to a gray December morning and the strange disorientation that comes after several nights spent sleeping in a hospital chair. For a few seconds, I expected fluorescent light above me and the soft electronic pulse of machines. Instead, I saw my own ceiling, the edge of my bedroom curtain, and the framed photograph of Ben and Ellie on the dresser. The phone buzzed again. I did not reach for it immediately. Somewhere down the hall, Ellie shifted in her bed. That sound was enough to pull me upright. I checked on her before I checked the phone. She was awake, but still curled beneath the comforter, her face pale against the pillow. Coming home had not magically restored her. She moved carefully when she sat up, one hand instinctively protecting her abdomen, and after crossing the short distance to the bathroom, she needed to lie down again. I brought her water and something bland enough not to make her stomach protest. She ate slowly while watching the bare branches outside her window. Then she asked whether we were going to Grandma's later. For years, December 26th had almost been an extension of Christmas. We went back to my parents' house for leftovers, because Mom always cooked enough for twice the number of people she actually invited. The children played with whatever toys had been abandoned, halfway through opening the day before. Dad reheated coffee. Mom complained that everyone had eaten too much, while putting another plate in front of them. Ellie had grown up assuming that routine was as fixed as Christmas itself. She asked whether Grandma would still have cinnamon rolls. I smoothed the blanket near her knees and told her we were staying home. She looked at me for a moment, waiting for the usual explanation. I could almost hear all the ones I might once have supplied. Grandma was tired. Yesterday had been complicated. We would see everyone soon. No reason to make more of it than necessary. I gave her none of them. "You need rest," I said. That was true, and for once I let the truth stand without wrapping my mother around it. Ellie nodded and returned to picking apart a piece of toast. She did not argue. The ease of her acceptance bothered me more than resistance would have. Only after she was settled on the couch did I look at my phone. There were calls from Mom, Dad, Heather, and Greg. Messenger notifications filled the lock screen, but I did not open the family thread. Whatever had been typed after I silenced it could wait. I already had the one sentence I needed to remember exactly. There was also a message from Nina Feldman, asking when she could call. I answered that one. Nina had helped me with a property matter before. She was competent in the way I appreciated most. She could take a complicated process and tell you what the next actual step was without pretending every decision needed to be made that minute. When she called, I moved into the kitchen so Ellie would not have to hear an adult conversation about a house she had spent her whole life calling Grandma's. Nina asked whether I was looking for a market evaluation or whether I had already decided to list. Evaluation first, I told her. I heard myself say it and understood something important about the difference between anger and action. Anger wanted the biggest possible movement. Action wanted the right next one. I explained only what she needed to know. The house was occupied. Any access had to be arranged properly. I was not asking anybody to appear without notice, and I was not trying to remove anyone overnight. I wanted to know what the property could realistically sell for, and what a responsible path would look like if I chose to proceed. Nina did not ask what had happened at Christmas. That was another reason I trusted her. She said she would contact the occupants directly to introduce herself and discuss a future evaluation time. We would talk again after she had done that. The entire conversation lasted only a few minutes. When it ended, I stood at the kitchen counter, looking at a bowl of fruit as though it contained an answer. For 5 years, I had carefully avoided language around my parents that made the legal reality of their house feel too visible. I had done it consciously at first, then out of habit. I still called it Mom's house, Dad's house, Grandma's house when speaking to Ellie. Yesterday, I had asked Nina to call the people living there, the occupants. The word sounded cold, and I did not enjoy it. But it was accurate. That distinction mattered more than I wanted it to. Nina called back a little before noon. Her tone was still professional, but I could hear that the conversation had not been routine. She told me she had introduced herself and said the owner had requested a market evaluation. My mother had initially insisted there must be some misunderstanding. When Nina repeated my name, Mom apparently changed direction and treated the call as some kind of family maneuver Nina had accidentally become involved in. Nina had declined the invitation. She did not argue about family history. She told Mom she was only calling about scheduling access and that anything else needed to be discussed with me. Dad, Nina said, had spoken very little. But unlike Mom, he had not appeared confused by the word owner. That detail sat differently in my stomach than I expected. Dad knew. Of course he knew. There had never been any secret from him or Mom about who owned the property. Whatever version Heather and Greg understood was another matter, one I had not yet considered. But my parents knew, and Dad knew what Nina's call meant. It meant I had finally done something he had spent years assuming I would never do. I thanked Nina and ended the call before the conversation could become anything more than it needed to be. Mom called less than 3 minutes later. I almost let it ring. Then I looked toward the living room. Ellie had fallen asleep beneath a blanket, with a television program playing softly in front of her. She needed her car seat cushion and a few things I had left in my vehicle. More importantly, I was going to have to retrieve that vehicle from my parents' driveway sometime that day. Avoidance was not going to make the next 24 hours disappear. I answered and stepped farther into the kitchen. Mom did not begin with Ellie. She began with Nina. The accusation came wrapped in disbelief rather than shouting. She wanted to know why I had sent a realtor to her home over one bad morning. She spoke as though the event had already been reduced to something unfortunate but contained, like a ruined pie or an argument over seating arrangements. One bad morning. I looked at the untouched coffee beside me and understood why the phrase worked. If this was only one bad morning, it could be forgiven quickly, and everybody could return to the same table without examining anything larger. But Mom still had not said she was sorry for the message Ellie had read. She had not asked whether Ellie had slept well. She had not asked whether her pain was manageable. She wanted me to explain the realtor. I told her I was not discussing the house while Ellie was recovering. She tried to pull the conversation back toward my behavior, saying I was escalating something that could have been handled privately and that families did not threaten each other's homes because feelings were hurt. I understood that she expected the old version of me to appear the one who would prove I was reasonable, admit I had been tired, accept that she had been under pressure, let Dad calm everyone down, and return to dinner a few days later. I did not restart that machinery. I told Mom Ellie needed me and ended the call. My hand shook slightly after I put the phone down, but not because she had shouted. She had not. Mom was at her most effective when she sounded like the only adult in the room. I washed the mug I had barely used and stood there long enough for my heartbeat to slow. By early afternoon, Ellie had rested enough for the trip to retrieve the car. I considered going alone, then remembered I did not have a vehicle to leave her in, and I was not ready to ask anybody else for another favor. A rideshare could take us there, and once I had my keys, we could come straight home. I bundled Ellie into a coat without rushing her. Even the small motions took more out of her than they normally would. She moved from the couch to the front door in stages and lowered herself into the rideshare carefully. The trip took a little over 20 minutes. I spent most of it watching familiar streets past the window. The closer we got to my parents' neighborhood, the more ordinary everything looked. Inflatable snowmen sagged on lawns in the daylight. Recycling bins had already begun accumulating cardboard boxes from Christmas gifts. Cars filled driveways. A boy in a winter coat was trying to ride a new scooter along the sidewalk while his father watched from the porch. Nothing about the neighborhood knew something had changed. Then, we turned onto the street where I had grown up. My parents' house looked almost exactly as it always did on December 26th. White lights still traced the roofline. The wreath Mom had ordered in November hung perfectly centered on the front door. Through the large front windows, the Christmas tree glowed even in daylight. And my car was sitting in the driveway, exactly where I had left it 5 days earlier. The sight of it made something inside me go very still. I had known the car was there. Knowing and seeing were different things. The rideshare stopped at the curb. I helped Ellie out slowly. She stood beside me for a moment, with one hand tucked into mine, looking toward the house. Through the window, I could see evidence of Christmas continuing without us. Wrapping paper had been collected but not completely cleared. A bright plastic toy sat near the sofa. Serving dishes were still stacked near the dining room. Somebody had left a child's new jacket over the back of a chair. The house had not paused. The family had read my request from inside that house and continued Christmas. My eyes moved from the windows to my car. Someone could have taken my keys. That was what lodged in me. They had not needed an elaborate plan. Dad, Heather, or Greg could have driven my car, or anyone could have used their own and brought us back later. Instead, 4 adults had stared at a phone while my car sat 20 feet from the Christmas tree. I had spent most of the night before trying to understand my mother's sentence. The parked car required no interpretation at all. The front door opened before we reached the porch. Dad stepped out and closed it behind him. He was holding my keys. For an instant, I noticed the most ridiculous things. The same brown house slippers he always wore, the crease down the front of his sweater, the way he had not put on a coat even though the air was cold. He came down the steps toward us, then stopped several feet away. His eyes went first to Ellie. He asked how she was feeling. Ellie said she was okay in the automatic way children sometimes do, when they do not want to explain their bodies to adults. Dad nodded. He looked as though he wanted to step forward and hug her, but he did not. Maybe he saw how she was holding herself. Maybe he noticed the space she had left between them. Then he held the keys out to me. I took them. Our fingers barely touched. Dad looked at the driveway instead of at my face. That bothered me more than if he had arrived defensive. My father had always been the gentle one. Mom could fill a room with certainty. Dad reduced tension. When arguments started, he lowered his voice. When somebody was offended, he found the neutral sentence. When Mom pushed too hard, he rarely contradicted her directly. He softened whatever came afterward. Standing in that driveway, I could see he knew there was nothing to soften. He had been in this house yesterday. He had known where my car was. He had read my message. The keys I was holding had been available to him the entire time. I did not ask him why. Not yet. Ellie shifted beside me, and I felt the small movement through our joined hands. Dad noticed too. He told me he had put a few things in the car that we had left behind before the ambulance. His voice had gone quieter. Then he said again that he hoped Ellie felt better. She thanked him. The politeness of it seemed to hit him. Dad finally looked at me. He started to say something, stopped, then told me he wanted to talk when I had time. I said we would. I did not promise when. He nodded and went back toward the porch. He looked older walking away than he had when he came out. I unlocked the car and helped Ellie into the passenger seat, because it was easier for her than climbing into the back. The inside smelled faintly stale from being closed for 5 cold days. Before I started the engine, I looked through the windshield at the house. It had been the background of almost every important family memory I possessed. Birthdays, graduations, Thanksgiving dinners. Ben standing in the kitchen with Dad the first Christmas after we married. Ellie learning to descend those front steps one cautious foot at a time when she was small. For 5 years, I had allowed everybody to speak about the house, as though nothing important had changed. I had thought I was preserving dignity. At that moment, I still did not understand how much had grown inside that silence. My phone rang before we had left the neighborhood. Heather. I let it ring once, then twice, before answering through the car system. Her first question was not about the hospital either. "What do you mean you own Mom's house?" I tightened my hand on the steering wheel. There it was. Not, "Why are you selling?" Not, "Are you really doing this?" She did not know. Or, she did not know enough. I told her we would talk later because Ellie was beside me. Heather lowered her voice immediately and said she was not trying to fight. She was confused. Mom had always told her I had helped when they refinanced. Something about putting my name on things because the bank situation had been complicated. That was not what had happened. I did not correct the whole story there, not with Ellie listening, but I asked Heather one question. "What exactly did Mom tell you?" Heather went quiet for long enough that I knew the answer was not going to be simple. She said she would call me later. We ended the call. Greg's message arrived before I reached home. His version was sharper. He wanted to know whether I had somehow used paperwork from years ago to take control of the house. The wording made it sound as though I had found a clause hidden in a contract and was now exploiting it. A technical loophole. I stared at the message when we stopped at a light. Heather thought I had helped refinance. Greg thought my name was buried in paperwork. Dad had never been confused at all. 3 people in the same family were operating with 3 different versions of the same house. I did not answer Greg. Ellie leaned her head against the seat. "Mom?" I glanced over. "Are we going home now?" "Yes." Her eyes closed again almost immediately. Home. I drove the remaining streets with that word moving quietly through my thoughts. When we reached my house, getting Ellie inside took most of my attention. I heated soup, arranged pillows, checked that she had water nearby, and made her promise to call if she needed to stand, rather than trying to prove she could do everything herself. Within an hour, she was asleep again. Only then did I sit down with my phone. I had a new voicemail from Dad. I almost listened to Greg's first. Anger is easier than disappointment, and Greg's message promised anger. I chose Dad. His voice sounded restrained, the way it had in the driveway. He said he wanted to meet with me alone when Ellie was settled enough for me to leave the house briefly. He specifically said he did not want Mom there. Then came the sentence that changed the question I thought I was asking. Heather and Greg weren't told what happened with the house the way it actually happened. Dad paused after saying it. He did not ask me to stop Nina. He did not tell me I was overreacting. He simply said there were things he should have made clear years ago, and that he wanted to explain his part in why he had not. The voicemail ended. I replayed only that sentence, not told the way it actually happened. I looked toward the front window, where my car now sat in my own driveway. That car had been at my parents' house for 5 days. Yesterday, while Ellie sat in a hospital discharge lobby, nobody had bothered to bring it. That fact was simple. The house was becoming something else entirely. I had spent the last 24 hours believing the deepest question was why 4 people who loved my daughter could read one small request and decide not to move. Now, another question had opened underneath it. For 5 years, my family had been gathering for Christmas, birthdays, Sunday dinners, and ordinary afternoons inside a house whose history they did not even agree on. Mom had one version, Heather had another, Greg had another. Dad knew the truth and had stayed quiet, and so had I. I put the phone down and looked through the glass at the car no one had brought me. I could not decide which hurt more, that my family had left my daughter, and me stranded when helping would have been so easy, or that for 5 years, we had all been living inside a story my mother found more comfortable than the truth. Dad chose a diner 20 minutes from my house, and almost exactly halfway between me and the place everyone still called his. That detail stayed with me as I drove there 2 days after Christmas. Ellie was home with enough energy to complain about being bored, but not enough to do much about it. She still moved carefully and slept more than usual. I arranged for her to be supervised, chose a diner close to home, and kept the meeting short. The diner was the kind of place Dad liked because nobody tried to improve coffee there. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, an artificial poinsettia on the counter that had probably been stored in the same cardboard box every December for 20 years. I saw him through the window before I went inside. He was early. He always was. Dad sat with both hands around a mug and looked smaller than he had across my parents' driveway. Not physically smaller. Exactly. More like the certainty had drained out of his posture. At home, he belonged to every chair. Here he was just a 69-year-old man waiting for his daughter to decide how much of him she still trusted. He stood when I approached, then seemed to think better of trying to hug me. His first question was about Ellie. I told him the truth. She was improving, still tired, still sore, eating better, sleeping a lot. His shoulders loosened a fraction. That was the difficult thing about my father. His concern was real. He had always loved Ellie. He had sat on the floor building wooden train tracks with her when she was 4. He had learned the names of the planets, because she went through a space phase at 7 and refused to accept that one with the rings as an answer. He kept cheap fruit-flavored candies in the glove box because she liked them. None of those memories changed the fact that he had sat 25 minutes away while she waited for a ride home from the hospital. Love and failure had occupied the same man. I was beginning to understand that one did not cancel the other. Dad asked whether Ellie had said anything about Christmas. Enough, I told him. I did not repeat her question. Not yet. He looked down into his coffee. There had been a time when I would have rushed to make that silence easier for him. I would have said I knew Mom could be difficult. I would have given him a place to stand between us where nobody had to admit anything too clearly. I left the silence alone. Finally, Dad said the reason he had asked me to meet without Mom was because the house had become tangled up with Christmas in a way that was going to make everything worse if we did not separate what was true from what everybody had been told. I almost laughed at the phrasing. Everybody had been told. Not everybody knew. That was the part I had spent the previous night thinking about. Heather believed I had helped refinance the house. Greg seemed to think my name had somehow ended up in documents that gave me leverage. Mom knew better, Dad knew better, and so did I. The actual story was not complicated. 5.5 years earlier, in June of 2021, my parents had reached the point where keeping the house no longer made financial sense. They were not destitute. They were not facing eviction or eating canned soup in the dark. But retirement had changed their numbers, and the house had not changed with them. There was still debt attached to it. Property taxes had climbed. Utilities and maintenance on 4 bedrooms and nearly 2,500 square feet did not care that nobody had children living upstairs anymore. Dad had tried to make it work longer than he should have. Mom had treated every suggestion of downsizing as if somebody were proposing to erase the family. That house had been theirs for decades. It was where Heather, Greg, and I grew up, where Mom had hosted birthdays and Christmases, where she knew which floorboard creaked outside the upstairs bathroom and exactly how long the oven took to recover after someone opened the door. Selling it, to Mom, did not mean changing addresses. It meant losing rank. I had not understood that at the time. All I understood in 2021 was that Dad had finally shown me numbers. He was embarrassed to show his own daughter and admitted that the house was consuming more of their retirement than they could comfortably sustain. The property had been appraised independently at around $350,000. I bought it for that amount. There was no secret bargain. Ben and I had built ordinary savings during our dual income years. I used about $70,000 for the down payment and financed the rest conventionally. My parents stayed under a written month-to-month rental agreement, and I remained in my own home. From the outside, almost nothing changed. That had been the point. Dad looked up when I finished putting the facts into words. Even to him, even after 5 years, hearing them spoken plainly, seemed to make the arrangement more real. "You saved us from having to leave then," he said. "I bought a house." The correction was quiet. Dad absorbed it. That distinction mattered now because "saved us" made what I had done sound like a permanent act of rescue, something noble and finished. A gift that could never be reconsidered without becoming cruelty. I had not purchased a role in their lives. I had purchased property and offered them a favorable way to remain in it. Dad knew that. He also knew why nobody talked about it. The waitress refilled his coffee, and the interruption gave him a few seconds he clearly needed. When she walked away, Dad rubbed his thumb along the handle of the mug. Then he told me something I already remembered, but had never examined closely enough. After the closing in 2021, Mom had gone nearly silent for 2 days. Not angry, humiliated. She had spent most of her adult life treating the house as proof that she and Dad had built something solid. Losing legal ownership even while remaining inside it felt to her like a public demotion no one else could see. Dad had called me then. I remembered standing at my kitchen counter while he asked for one favor. "Please do not keep calling it your house around her." At the time, I had thought the request cost me nothing. I had my own home. I did not need to announce ownership every time we walked through the front door. I did not need Mom to thank me publicly. I did not need Heather or Greg to know the details of my finances. So I agreed. Dad had gone further. He told Heather and Greg only that I had helped with the mortgage situation. His words now were almost identical to the softened phrase Heather had repeated to me. He had never told them plainly that I had purchased the property and that he and Mom remained under a rental agreement. By protecting Mom's dignity, he had left enough blank space for a softer story to take over. "And she did," I said. Dad did not answer immediately. He did not need to. The problem had not begun with a lie bold enough for anyone to challenge. It had begun with omission, with courtesy, with everyone deciding there was no need to embarrass Mom. Then time did what time often does to arrangements nobody names. It turned temporary accommodations into permanent expectations. Mom kept hosting. Of course she did. She rearranged the guest room when Heather's children started staying overnight. She told Greg which closet he could use for sports equipment and boxes he did not want in his apartment. She replaced curtains, complained about the furnace, chose flowers for the front beds, and called everyone home for Sunday dinners. None of those things had struck me as wrong. Why would they? She lived there. It was still her home in every emotional sense that mattered. The change happened quietly enough that I could not point to a single day. At first, Mom avoided the ownership subject because it hurt. Later, she behaved as though avoiding the subject had settled it. She stopped asking before making changes. She stopped speaking, as though the arrangement had been something I had enabled. Audrey helped us keep the house. Gradually became, we kept the house. Then simply our house and the family home. By the time Ellie was 8 or 9, even I called it Grandma's house without thinking. I had treated the silence as kindness. Mom had come to experience it as confirmation. The shift was so gradual that I had never asked what it was teaching the rest of us. Dad stared through the diner window while cars moved across the wet parking lot. "I should have corrected it years ago," he said. There was no dramatic confession in his voice. That made it worse. It sounded like an ordinary fact a person had finally run out of ways to avoid. I asked him why he had not. He gave me several versions of the same answer without needing many words. Mom was proud. The arrangement was working. Everyone was getting along. There seemed to be no reason to create discomfort when there was no immediate problem. Peace had become its own justification. That was my father's pattern. If nothing was on fire, he could convince himself that moving the gasoline was unnecessary. I thought about Christmas morning, my car in their driveway, my keys inside, Mom saying Ellie had survived, therefore enough had already been asked of everyone. Dad knowing the ride had never been arranged. I did not accuse him then. Part of me wanted to. Instead, I asked something more difficult. At some point, did you start believing I'd never make you leave? His eyes moved back to mine. That was the first moment of the conversation when he looked truly cornered. Not because I was threatening him, because the honest answer embarrassed him. Yes, he said. One word. It sat between us. Dad explained that after Ben died, everybody saw how hard I worked to keep Ellie connected to the family. I made sure she came to birthdays. I preserved Christmas routines. I drove over for Sunday dinners, even when I was tired. I encouraged grandpa calls and cousin sleepovers. He had interpreted all of that as evidence that the house itself was safe. Not legally safe, emotionally untouchable. Because if I changed the arrangement, I would be changing the place where Ellie's extended family gathered. He had not thought I would risk that. I sat back in the booth. There it was. The thing I valued most had become leverage against me, without anyone ever needing to threaten me with it. Nobody had said, Audrey will never sell because she is afraid Ellie will lose her family. They did not have to. They had simply learned it. I had taught them. For years, I had behaved as though preserving the structure was part of being a good mother. It had never occurred to me that everyone around me might eventually begin treating that commitment as immunity from consequence. The waitress brought the check. Dad reached for it automatically. I let him take it. Some habits did not need symbolism. Before we left, he said something else I did not expect. He did not ask me to stop the evaluation. He did not tell me to cancel Nina. He said he wanted me to know that if Heather and Greg were angry, part of that anger came from information he had failed to give them. That mattered. It did not excuse Christmas. But it mattered. Outside, the air had the damp cold of an Ohio winter without snow. Dad put on his gloves slowly. I watched him walk toward his car and thought about the strange architecture of families. How people could spend years building around one person's discomfort until no one remembered which walls were structural and which had only been placed there to keep her from feeling exposed. When I got home, Ellie was awake on the couch. She had built a small nest from 2 blankets and was watching a baking show. The sight of frosting reminded me, unexpectedly, of Mom. Not Christmas morning. An older memory. Ellie had been 8, standing on a stool in Mom's kitchen with flour on her nose, while Mom showed her how to roll sugar cookie dough evenly. Mom had been patient that afternoon, in a way I rarely was with messy baking. She let Ellie cut the same star shape over and over, because it was the one she liked. She pretended not to notice when Ellie ate pieces of dough. Another year, Mom had remembered the exact art set Ellie had pointed out once in October and found it for her birthday in April. She had been delighted by Ellie's reaction. Those moments were real. That was part of what made Christmas so difficult to understand. If Mom had never loved Ellie, the story would have been simpler. I could have named the problem years ago. But Mom did love her. Mom did love Ellie. She loved baking afternoons, exact gifts, birthdays planned weeks ahead, and the parts of grandmotherhood that fit easily onto calendars and around tables. The failures came when parking was awful, timing was inconvenient, somebody needed a ride, or plans had to change. I had spent years putting those warm moments against the disappointments and declaring the scale balanced. That evening, Heather called. I waited until Ellie was resting upstairs before answering. Heather sounded different from the day before. The accusation was gone, replaced by a kind of unsettled embarrassment. I told her the house story, exactly as Dad and I had discussed it. 4 facts. Our parents could no longer afford to keep the house comfortably. It was independently appraised. I bought it. They stayed under a rental agreement. I gave Heather the facts without sending documents or turning the conversation into a proof exercise. She knew me well enough to hear when I was stating something rather than arguing it. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she admitted Mom had never described it that way. She had believed I helped refinance because Dad and Mom needed assistance qualifying or restructuring debt. Greg apparently had understood even less. Heather sounded offended by the omission, though she still resisted what I was considering doing. Selling the house, she said, felt extreme. I did not argue that point either. Maybe it was. I had not yet decided how far I would go. What I had decided was that, "You cannot do this because it is Mom's house," was no longer going to be treated as a fact. Heather asked whether Mom knew I had actually purchased it. Yes. Another silence. That silence was different. I could almost hear the family story rearranging itself in her head. Then Heather began defending herself about Christmas. Not because I had asked, because guilt tends to search for an exit once another argument stops working. She said she had considered leaving to come get us. I stayed quiet. She continued. Mom had told her directly that the hospital had transportation options. That discharge meant Ellie was no longer in danger. That I was turning everything into another situation where the whole family had to rearrange itself around me and Ellie. Heather hesitated before repeating the phrase Mom had used. Don't feed the drama. My fingers tightened around the phone. I had never told Mom transportation had been arranged. Because it had not been. Yes, there were hospital options. Yes, eventually I could have found a ride. But Mom had taken the existence of alternatives and turned it into proof that nobody needed to answer me. I asked whether Greg had been told the same thing. Heather said not exactly. As far as she knew, Greg had only seen Mom's group message and assumed someone else was handling the ride. Dad had been there when Mom said I would manage. Different people, different information, the same result. For the first time, I could see that Christmas morning had not been a secret plan. That almost made it worse. Nobody had gathered in the kitchen and agreed to leave an 11-year-old waiting at a hospital. Mom had framed the situation. Then each person had found his or her own comfortable reason to accept that frame. Heather had a working car. She had thought about coming. She had decided not to. The full explanation was still ahead of us, and I could feel her moving toward it without wanting to arrive. I stood beside my kitchen window and watched the last week daylight fade from the yard. My voice stayed calm when I finally asked her the question that had been forming since Dad told me how many years our family had lived inside a softened version of the truth. When Mom told you not to answer me, did you believe her, or did you just want to? Heather did not answer. For several seconds, all I could hear was her breathing. And in that pause, I heard the beginning of an answer neither of us wanted. Heather's silence lasted long enough that I stopped waiting for a defense. The refrigerator clicked on behind me. Somewhere upstairs, Ellie moved across the hallway with the cautious steps she had been taking since coming home. Outside the kitchen window, the bare branches along our street shifted in a weak winter wind. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear and listened to my sister breathe. When Heather finally spoke, her voice had lost the sharp edge it had carried the day after Christmas. She said she had believed Mom. Then she corrected herself. She had wanted to believe Mom. That difference mattered. On Christmas morning, Heather had been at my parents' house with her husband and children. Her car was in the driveway. She had seen my messenger request while her kids were opening gifts. According to her, she had actually started thinking through the practical details of leaving, whether to take both children with her, whether her husband could stay behind, how long the round trip would take. Then Mom had told her the hospital had transportation options. Discharge meant Ellie was medically stable. Nobody needed to panic. I was capable of getting us home. And, in Mom's version, what I was really asking was not for a 25-minute drive. I was asking everyone to choose me again. Heather did not repeat the whole conversation word for word. I did not need her to. What mattered was the reasoning she had accepted. Her children were already disappointed that Christmas had been disrupted by Ellie's hospitalization. Mom was stressed. Food was getting cold. Heather did not want to be the person who stood up in the middle of everything and announced that she was leaving. So she stayed seated. That was the truth beneath all the softer words. I leaned against the kitchen counter. You could have called me. I know. That was one of the few direct answers she gave me. Heather could have checked whether a ride was actually coming with one sentence. "Do you still need somebody?" Instead, Mom had given her an explanation that allowed her to stay exactly where she was. And Heather accepted it because keeping Christmas easy was more convenient than verifying what we needed. Heather started to say she had not realized we would be waiting that long, but stopped herself. I think she heard what the sentence sounded like, before I had to point it out. The length of the wait was not the moral problem. If we had waited 10 minutes instead of an hour, 4 people had still seen a child's mother ask for help and chosen not to answer. I did not yell. Heather was not a cruel person. She remembered birthdays, showed up with food, and had helped me in ordinary ways before. That was precisely what made Christmas harder to dismiss. She had watched my message appear, considered coming, and stayed, because leaving would have complicated the room she was sitting in. People did not have to be cruel to participate in something cruel. When we ended the call, Heather did not ask me to reconsider the house. For the first time, she said she needed to think. I understood the feeling. I had been doing almost nothing else. Greg's explanation came later, and took far less time. He never gave me the confession Heather did, mostly because there was less to confess and more to expose. He had seen my message. He had seen Mom's reply. Nobody had directly told him not to go. He had simply looked at the silence in the family thread and assumed somebody else had already taken responsibility. Dad was there. Heather was there. Mom was there. Surely one of them had a plan. That was the story he told himself. He did not call me because, in his words, he did not want to create more confusion if arrangements had already been made. It was exactly the sort of sentence Greg had always been able to produce when responsibility passed close enough for him to notice, but not close enough to grab him. Greg was not lying. He genuinely assumed another adult would handle it. He simply never checked, because checking might have made him the adult responsible for acting. Mom's message gave him permission. Everyone else's silence gave him cover, and he took the path of least resistance. Afterward, I sat at the edge of my bed and stared at the floor for a long time. Heather had chosen not to upset Mom. Greg had chosen not to verify. Different reasons, same parked car. Dad was the one I could not fit into the same shape. He had not been confused about logistics. He had known where my car was. He had known where the keys were. He had promised days earlier that somebody would bring it or pick us up. I waited until Ellie was asleep that evening before calling him. I did not ask him everything, just one question. "Did you know nobody had agreed to bring the car?" The pause was shorter than Heather's. "Yes," I closed my eyes. Dad explained quietly that by Christmas morning, Mom had become increasingly resentful of how much the hospital had already changed the week. She had spent part of the emergency night there. Dad had returned with my purse and charger. Heather had brought food. Christmas plans had shifted around updates from me. None of it had been extraordinary caregiving, but enough had happened that Mom had begun talking as though the entire family had already surrendered something substantial. When I asked for the ride, Dad knew Mom believed the crisis was finished. Discharge meant safe. Safe meant normal life could resume. He told himself I was capable. I always figured things out. If nobody went immediately, I would call a rideshare or ask the hospital. Mostly, he admitted, he did not want to restart an argument with Mom when she was already angry about Christmas being interrupted enough. I looked toward Ellie's bedroom door. My father had loved her for 11 years. He knew the car was there, and he had decided protecting peace with his wife was more urgent than checking whether his granddaughter had a ride home. There was no sentence I could give him that would make the choice sound different. He tried to tell me he was ashamed. I believed him. That did not change the decision he had made. For most of my life, Dad's gentleness had seemed like moral goodness. He rarely raised his voice. He did not humiliate people. He disliked cruelty. He could sit with a frightened child and make the room feel safer without needing credit for it. But there was another side to being the person who always kept peace. Sometimes peace required somebody else to absorb what should have been confronted. Dad had spent years smoothing the surface around Mom. On Christmas, Ellie had become the thing he was willing to let sink beneath it. After the call, I stopped ranking who had failed us worst. Mom had minimized the need. Heather had consciously stayed. Greg had assumed, and Dad had known. The more useful question was how four adults with different motives had reached the same result. It was not a simple absence of affection. The common factor was the rule underneath their choices. Ellie could need things, as long as those needs remained easy. Once care required bad parking, changed plans, a drive across town, or somebody else giving something up, the questions began. Was this really necessary? Could Audrey handle it? Was there another option? Different questions, same rule. Ellie was welcome as long as nobody else had to move. Once I saw it, I could not stop seeing it. A few days later, Ellie was strong enough to spend more time downstairs. She still tired quickly, but some of her personality had returned. She complained that I cut apple slices too thick. She laughed at something on television. She negotiated for more screen time with the seriousness of a labor attorney while still wearing fuzzy socks. Those ordinary pieces of her coming back mattered more to me than anything else. One afternoon, I mentioned that Grandpa had asked how she was feeling and that Grandma might want to know she was improving too. Ellie shrugged. It was such a small reaction that I almost missed what followed. She probably won't come if parking is bad. She said it while arranging crackers on a plate. There was no accusation in it, only the matter-of-fact tone she might have used to say, Grandma disliked spicy food. I watched her move one cracker from one side of the plate to the other. When did you start thinking that? Ellie looked up, confused by the question. She reminded me of a school event from months earlier. Mom had originally said she would come, then canceled after hearing the parking situation would be difficult. Another time, she had decided an evening activity was too late. Ellie had stopped taking some invitations seriously, not because she thought Grandma did not love her, because Grandma had reasons. That was how Ellie explained it. Grandma hated parking. Grandma did not like driving after dark. Grandma got tired. I could hear my own voice inside every explanation. I had offered those reasons lovingly because they hurt less than saying an adult simply had not made the effort. But children learn from the explanations we repeat. Ellie had learned not to expect too much from Grandma when showing up became inconvenient. She had not concluded that she was less loved. She had not concluded she was less family. Christmas was the first time those two ideas had touched. Before Christmas, the disappointment had been about reliability. Grandma probably won't come. At the hospital, it became something different. Am I not family? The distinction mattered. It also frightened me, because it meant Christmas had not created the pattern. It had only changed what the pattern meant to Ellie. I spent the next several days resisting the temptation to search our entire past for evidence. It would have been easy to do. Once you find a pattern, every old disappointment starts volunteering for membership. I did not want to rewrite my mother into a monster simply because I was angry with her now, so I forced myself to think about only two memories. One difficult, one good. The difficult one was small enough that I had barely remembered it until then. 2 years earlier, I had needed help on a weekday afternoon when a work meeting ran late and Ellie needed to be picked up from an activity. Mom had been technically available, but the trip would have meant crossing town during rush hour. She declined, saying the traffic would be awful and that I could probably arrange something else. I did. A few days later, she brought Ellie a beautiful set of markers she had seen in a store. Ellie loved them. At the time, I had put the two moments together as proof Mom cared in her own way. She could not help with the ride, but look how thoughtful she was afterward. Now I saw something else. The markers were easy. They could be purchased when Mom chose. The ride would have cost her an inconvenient afternoon. The second memory went the other direction. Ellie's birthday the following year had been at a small art studio on a Saturday afternoon. Good parking, fixed start time, cute photographs. Mom arrived early, helped arrange the cake, laughed through the whole event, and posted one of the pictures later because Ellie had paint on the end of her nose. She had been wonderful, not pretending to be wonderful. Wonderful. The difference was not whether Mom loved Ellie. It was what love was allowed to cost her. I had spent years treating those two kinds of moments as interchangeable. A missed need followed by a thoughtful gift. An inconvenient absence balanced against a beautiful birthday. If the totals felt roughly equal, I called the relationship healthy. I was beginning to understand that children do not experience love as a spreadsheet. Showing up when it is easy does not erase failing them when they genuinely need you. That realization did not make me feel righteous. It made me tired. Because once I stopped treating Christmas as one terrible morning, I had to ask what role I had played in making the rule possible. Heather forced me to answer sooner than I wanted. We spoke again shortly after New Year's. She was less defensive by then. She had not suddenly become fearless around Mom, and she still thought selling the house might be too far. But she had started looking at Christmas differently. At one point, while we were talking about Mom's habit of explaining other people's needs before they could explain themselves, Heather said something so quietly I nearly missed it. "You explained her too." I knew immediately what she meant. I still resisted. I told Heather I had been trying to protect Ellie. There was no point telling a little girl every time an adult disappointed her that the adult had made a selfish choice. Children did not need to carry every ugly interpretation. Heather agreed. Then she said, "But you explained Mom to us too. Every time." That landed differently. I thought about all the family conversations where someone had been irritated with Mom, and I had softened it. She is stressed. She means well. She hates hospitals. She worries about schedules. She just likes things organized. I had not only translated Mom for Ellie, I had translated Mom for everyone. I had helped preserve the idea that every disappointment had a reasonable explanation, which meant no single disappointment was ever important enough to require change. I had thought I was preventing conflict. Maybe I had been preventing consequence. The thought made me sit down. For years, my family had learned that Mom could push too far, and I would still arrive Sunday. She could disappoint Ellie, and I would still bring Ellie back Christmas morning. Dad could remain silent, and I would understand why. Heather could avoid tension, and I would make the next gathering normal. Greg could forget, assume, arrive late, and somebody would smooth it over. I had not created their choices, but I had spent years making sure their choices did not threaten the structure. After Ben died, that had felt like love. Keep the family intact. Keep people close. Make sure Ellie does not lose anyone else. I had never stopped to ask whether preserving every relationship was teaching Ellie something I did not want her to learn. Heather did not say any of that. She did not need to. Her one sentence had opened the door. That evening, Ellie sat at the kitchen table, drawing nothing in particular on the back of an old grocery list while I made dinner. She had more color in her face now. Her movements were less guarded. Every so often she hummed under her breath, something she had done since she was little. I looked at her and thought about all the times she had casually lowered expectations without ever questioning the title people held in her life. Grandma was still Grandma, even if Grandma did not come. Grandpa was still Grandpa, even if he stayed quiet. Aunt Heather was family, even if she chose the easier room. For years, Ellie had adapted without asking what those adaptations meant. Christmas had changed that. It had taken all the little explanations I had given her: parking, schedules, tiredness, inconvenience, and pushed them into 1 hour in a hospital lobby where every adult knew exactly what she needed. Before Christmas, Ellie's lesson had been, Grandma probably won't come. Christmas gave her a new possibility. Maybe I don't count enough for anyone to come. And the part I could no longer escape was that Mom had not taught her that lesson alone. For years, I had been standing beside the pattern, giving it kinder names. By the first week of January, Ellie was well enough to be irritated by how often I asked whether she was tired. That was progress. She could sit at the kitchen table through breakfast now, without needing to lie down halfway through. She moved more naturally, though I still caught the protective way her hands sometimes drifted toward her abdomen when she stood too quickly. The hospital had receded from the center of our days. Pill bottles and bland meals no longer seemed to occupy every surface. Her laughter had started appearing without effort. From the outside, our life was beginning to look normal again. Inside my head, Christmas was becoming harder to contain. For several days after Heather told me that I had spent years explaining Mom to everyone, I kept resisting the idea. Not because Heather was wrong, exactly. Because accepting it required me to reconsider something I had always believed was one of the better things I had done as a mother. After Ben died, I had made a promise to myself that Ellie would not keep losing people. She was 5 years old when he died in October of 2020, old enough to understand that Daddy was gone, too young to understand why the world could keep moving afterward. I remembered the months after Ben's death less as scenes than as absences. 1 toothbrush instead of 2, his side of the closet left untouched, and 5-year-old Ellie asking whether Grandma, or I might disappear too. Grief made her count who was gone, and then count who remained. I could not give Ellie her father back, so I became almost obsessive about protecting the rest of the list. Grandma, Grandpa, Aunt Heather, Uncle Greg, Chloe, and the other cousins. Birthdays, Sunday dinners, Christmas morning, at the same house, the kitchen where Mom had measured flour into Ellie's hands. The staircase Ellie had once descended sitting down because she was afraid of missing a step. I told myself continuity was safety. At the time, I think it was. That mattered to me now. I did not want to rewrite my younger self as foolish, just because I could finally see where the choice had led. There had been nothing weak about wanting to give a grieving 5-year-old a stable world. I had watched Ellie lose the person she assumed would always be there. Of course I had wanted to surround her with everyone who remained. The mistake came later. Somewhere along the way, preserving relationships stopped being something I offered Ellie and became something I believed I owed her. I stopped asking whether a relationship was good in its current form. I asked only how to keep it. That was how explanations became habits. Grandma is tired. Grandpa hates conflict. Heather has little kids. Greg forgot. Everybody loves you in their own way. None of those sentences were completely false, which was what made them so useful. The problem was not the truth inside them. It was what I used that truth to cover. By early January, even I had begun doing it again. It happened one night after Ellie went upstairs to shower. I was clearing dishes when the thought came quietly enough that I almost accepted it without noticing. It had been one bad morning. That was Mom's phrase now. One bad morning, one bad Christmas. A terrible message written under stress. I stopped with a plate in my hand. For perhaps 10 seconds, the version felt reasonable. 5 hospital days. Holiday pressure. Everybody tired. Mom angry. Me angry. Surely families had survived worse than one cruel text and a missed ride. I could already feel the old machinery starting. So I dried my hands, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the screenshot I had saved on Christmas Day. I had not looked at the screenshot since Christmas. The exact line was still there. Stop turning her discharge into a family event. She survived. That should be enough. I read it once and let those words replace the kinder version my mind had already begun manufacturing. What bothered me most was how quickly I had started editing. In less than 2 weeks, she survived. That should be enough. Had become Mom was overwhelmed. The same instinct that had protected Ellie for years was already protecting my mother from the full meaning of what she had done. I deleted nothing. I closed the image. I never needed to look at it again. The screenshot had done what I saved it to do. It reminded me that memory could be merciful in ways truth did not always deserve. A few days later, while Ellie and I were eating lunch, I asked her something I had been afraid to ask since Heather's comment. I tried not to make it sound important. I asked whether she had ever stopped inviting Grandma to things, because she expected Grandma would say no. Ellie considered the question, while peeling a corner from the label on her water bottle. There was no dramatic revelation. She gave me examples. A school music night the previous spring because Grandma disliked driving after dark. A weekend activity where parking would probably be difficult. A classroom event where she had decided there was no point asking because Mom had already mentioned how early it started. She talked about those choices as if she were explaining weather. Then she said something that made my throat tighten. I figured she still loved me. She just doesn't like that stuff. There it was. The distinction I had been trying to understand. Before Christmas, Ellie had lowered her expectations. She had not lowered her sense of belonging. She did not believe Grandma skipped inconvenient things because she was less important than Chloe or Greg's son or anybody else. She believed Grandma had preferences, limitations, annoying habits, just like every adult. And I had helped her believe that. For years that had probably protected her. The part I could no longer ignore was what happened when the pattern became too large for the explanation. At the hospital, parking had not been the issue. Night driving had not been the issue. Schedules had not been the issue. 4 people had seen a direct request while my daughter sat waiting to come home after 5 days of hospital care. That was the first time Ellie had connected unreliability to worth. I asked whether she had ever thought before Christmas that Grandma did not consider her family. She looked almost surprised. No. Then, after a moment, she added, I just thought she had reasons. I nodded because I could not think of anything safe to say. She went back to her sandwich. That was another painful thing about children. Sometimes they hand you the truth and then ask whether they can have chips. Ellie did not blame me. She did not tell me I had failed her. She did not possess the vocabulary, or the interest, to analyze the family system I had spent 2 weeks turning over in my head. She had simply trusted the explanations I gave her. That trust made my guilt heavier, not lighter. The package arrived the following afternoon. It was addressed to Ellie in Mom's handwriting. For a moment, I stood inside the front door holding it, and felt something close to irritation that the box existed at all. Then I hated myself for that reaction. Ellie noticed the return address. Grandma? I handed it to her. I had no right to turn a package into a loyalty test. She opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was the exact pair of lavender wireless headphones she had wanted before Christmas. Not just headphones. Those headphones. Weeks earlier, while we were all at Mom's house, Ellie had apparently mentioned that Chloe's pair fit comfortably over her ears and that she wanted the lavender version instead of white. I had forgotten the conversation completely. Mom had not. Ellie lifted them from the box and smiled before catching herself. That tiny hesitation hurt. She looked at me as though enjoying the gift might be taking a side. You can like them, I told her. Her shoulders relaxed. There was a card beneath the packaging. Mom had written that she missed Ellie, hoped she was feeling stronger every day, and had remembered how much she liked the headphones. She signed it with love. There was no apology. No mention of the hospital. No acknowledgement of the message. No sentence that said, I should have come. The gift was genuinely thoughtful. Mom knew Ellie well enough to remember colors, sizes, favorite desserts, and small wishes mentioned weeks earlier. Love existed. I did not need to deny that. But it had arrived in a form Mom controlled completely, an item she could choose, order, mail, and accompany with affectionate words without admitting she had been wrong or sitting with Ellie's hurt. I watched Ellie fit the headphones over her ears. She grinned, because they were exactly right. I smiled back. Both things were true. The gift was loving. The absence was still real. I was beginning to understand how much damage could happen when a family insisted one truth had to erase the other. Dottie came by the next day carrying enough food for a family of 6, while insisting she had brought just a little soup. By then, I had learned that arguing with Dottie about quantities only extended the conversation, so I stepped aside and let her carry containers into my kitchen. There was soup, there were rolls. There was something involving potatoes in a dish I recognized as one of mine, which meant she had somehow acquired it earlier and I had forgotten. There was also half a pie, because, according to Dottie, a whole pie would have been excessive. Ellie was upstairs resting, and Dottie kept her voice lower than usual for approximately 3 minutes before forgetting and returning to normal volume. She complained about the grocery store changing its aisle signs, and about a man 3 houses over who kept putting his trash cans too close to the curb. I unpacked containers while she talked. It was precisely the kind of ordinary noise I had not realized I needed. At some point she asked how I was doing. Not Ellie, me. The question caught me badly. I said I was fine, then admitted I was not sure what I was doing anymore. Dottie put a lid onto the wrong container and frowned at it. I told her, in the most compressed way possible, that after Ben died I had become convinced Ellie needed a full family around her. A crowded table, grandparents and cousins and every holiday kept intact. I had thought losing those things would be another injury. Dottie did not tell me my mother was toxic. She did not tell me to sell anything. She did not ask for details about the realtor. She finished forcing the wrong lid onto the container, realized what she had done, pulled it off again, and said, "A child doesn't need a crowded table, Audrey. She needs to know who will get up from it when she calls." I stood still. Dottie found the correct lid. Then she immediately started complaining that whoever designed plastic food containers had deliberately created 17 nearly identical sizes to destroy civilization. She had moved on. I had not. For days, I had been trying to describe what was wrong with Christmas without turning it into a debate about who loved whom. Dottie had reduced it to one question. Who gets up when staying seated would be easier? She had no family title at all, and she had put on shoes. I did not decide anything that afternoon. That mattered. I did not want one good sentence from a neighbor to become the moral permission slip for selling my parents' home. The house deserved more seriousness than that. So did I. So did Ellie. Nina's update came a few days later and was deliberately unremarkable. The market evaluation showed that selling the house was realistic. Nothing miraculous had happened to its value. There was no surprise fortune waiting inside the equity. It was simply a desirable suburban property in a market where a properly priced home could sell. Nina reminded me that my parents' occupancy could not be treated as an inconvenience to work around. We had a written month-to-month agreement. If I chose to end it, notice had to be given correctly, and the timeline respected. Any later appraisal or showing access would also be arranged properly. I asked what the responsible next step would be if I decided to proceed. She told me. I wrote it down. Then we stopped talking about real estate. The fact that selling was possible did not make the decision easier. It made it real. Until then, the realtor had partly existed in my mind as a line I had sent while furious. The realtor will explain the rest. Now there was an actual path. A path meant I had to decide whether I truly intended to walk it. The phrase, "one bad Christmas morning," had begun spreading through the family by then. Mom did not need a formal campaign. Families are efficient at distributing the version of events that creates the least discomfort. Heather told me a few relatives were saying they could understand why I was angry, but not why the house had anything to do with it. Greg was less careful. According to him, I was punishing everybody because nobody reacted perfectly during a stressful holiday. Even Dad, though he did not defend Mom's message anymore, asked me once whether I was certain the house needed to become part of the consequence. I had no immediate answer for him. That was the point where my anger stopped being useful. Anger could explain Christmas Day. It could not explain March. If I ended my parents' rental arrangement, I would not only be changing Mom's life, Dad would move too. The house where I had grown up would leave the family. The dining room where Ben had once sat arguing with Greg about football would belong to strangers. The kitchen where Ellie learned to roll cookies would be somebody else's kitchen. There would be no grandma's house next Christmas. No familiar staircase. No old bedroom upstairs where cousins piled blankets onto the floor. Those were real losses. I could not dismiss them merely because Mom had done something I found unforgivable in that moment. One night I stood in Ellie's doorway after she fell asleep and asked myself the question I had been avoiding. If Christmas truly had been one bad day, would I still sell the house? The answer did not come immediately. That frightened me. Because revenge loves certainty. If I had wanted only to hurt Mom, I could have held on to Christmas morning like a weapon and never asked what else the decision would destroy. Instead, I forced myself to separate the questions. Was I angry enough to want Mom to lose the house? Sometimes, yes. Was anger a good enough reason to make it happen? No. So I tried again. I asked myself one cleaner question. If Mom apologized perfectly tomorrow, would the housing arrangement suddenly become healthy? No. An apology could affect a relationship, but it could not undo what the house had become. A physical center I had spent years maintaining, while Mom's authority around it hardened into expectation. That was the difference I needed. I did not have to sell the house because Mom had failed one test. I could decide the arrangement itself no longer made sense because I had finally seen what I was helping preserve. That did not remove the grief. It removed the need for revenge to be the reason. I began preparing for the next formal step. Not that night, not impulsively, carefully. I reviewed the agreement again. I checked the dates. I made sure I understood what I was asking two people in their late 60s to do and how much time they would have. Then Mom called. I almost did not answer, but by then I had stopped wanting every difficult conversation to happen through somebody else. Her voice was calmer than it had been the day after Christmas. That made the sentence land harder. She told me people were worried. She said Heather was upset. Dad was barely sleeping. Greg thought I had lost perspective. She reminded me that Ellie had already lost her father. Then she reached directly for the fear that had governed 6 years of my life. If you sell that house, Ellie will grow up knowing you're the one who broke what was left of her family. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Not because I believed Mom was right, because some part of me had spent 6 years terrified that she might be. A few days after Mom told me Ellie would grow up believing I had broken what was left of our family, she sent the kind of message she had sent for years. Sunday dinner at 6. There was no apology or conversation about Christmas attached to it. Mom simply announced Sunday dinner, as though the family would return to its old positions. Her warning about me breaking the family still hurt because selling the house would cost Dad, Ellie, and me something real. But pain and wrongness were not the same question. I could grieve the house and still decide the arrangement needed to end. The phrasing was what it had always been. Not quite an invitation, more a fact. For years, Mom had treated Sunday dinner as gravity. Schedules could bend, people could arrive late, but everyone eventually came back to the house. I read the message twice. Before Christmas, I would have begun negotiating. Maybe Ellie and I could come for an hour. Maybe we could leave early if she got tired. Maybe I could bring something. Instead, I sent one sentence saying, we would not be there. Nothing more. Mom did not respond to me directly. Heather sent a vague message saying she was not sure what they were doing yet. Greg reacted as if dinner was obviously still happening. Dad said nothing. For the rest of the afternoon, the thread stayed unusually quiet. I put my phone away and helped Ellie fold laundry badly enough that half the towels needed to be redone. She was moving more comfortably now. Her appetite had improved. She still tired faster than before the hospital, but I no longer watched every step as if her body might betray her without warning. At 6 o'clock Sunday evening, I was making grilled cheese in my own kitchen. That felt stranger than it should have. I knew, without looking at a clock, what would normally be happening across town. Mom would be opening the oven. Dad would be carrying dishes, even if she told him he was putting them in the wrong place. Greg would arrive later than he claimed he would. Heather's children would move through the house, with the easy entitlement of grandchildren who knew which cabinets contained snacks. Ellie would usually be somewhere in the middle of it. Instead, she was sitting at my table doing a puzzle while I burned one side of a sandwich. She looked up at the smell and said, "Dad would have called that extra crispy." The sentence hit me unexpectedly. Ben had called every cooking mistake intentional. I laughed. Then I turned the sandwich over and scraped the dark edge with a knife. For the first time in years, Sunday dinner happened without us. And nothing catastrophic occurred. The strangest part was how much of the evening had already been organized around a routine we were not attending. Before Christmas, I would have started watching the clock around 4:30. I would have checked whether Ellie had finished whatever she was doing, found the container I had promised to return to Mom, and mentally calculated how late we could leave without getting the look that meant I had disrupted dinner. That Sunday, I kept waiting for my body to begin the routine anyway. At 5:15, I opened the coat closet for no reason and saw Ellie's boots lined beneath mine. At 5:40, I caught myself wondering whether traffic would be bad on the main road. Then, I remembered we were not going anywhere. I set 2 plates on my own table. Ellie pushed 2 puzzle pieces aside to make room, and we ate while the sky outside the kitchen window went dark. Nobody was measuring when we arrived or how long we stayed. I did not spend dinner listening for the moment Mom would begin clearing plates as a signal that the evening was moving to its next approved stage. The quiet was not magical. Ellie complained that I had cut her sandwich unevenly, and I discovered we were almost out of milk. But the ordinary inconvenience belonged to our house and our evening. For the first time, staying home was not something I had to justify against a larger family plan. That should not have felt revolutionary. It did. I learned the next day that the dinner itself had not gone normally either. Heather had chosen not to bring the kids. She had not made a speech about it. She simply said they were staying home. Greg had shown up late, eaten, and left earlier than usual. Dad had not called me to pressure me into reconsidering. Mom had cooked for more people than came. Heather told me only a little of this. I did not ask for a detailed report. I did not need one. The image was enough. Mom still had the dining room, the long table, the serving dishes, and the house everybody called home. Yet for the first time, the house had failed to produce the family on command. People had simply stopped responding automatically. January 15th arrived without ceremony. I had spent the previous days reviewing the rental agreement and the timeline until I could no longer pretend I was acting impulsively. Mom and Dad's written month-to-month agreement required 60 days notice ending at the close of a monthly rental period. I gave them notice that the tenancy would end March 31st. It was more time than the minimum written into our situation required once the dates were counted properly, and it gave them weeks to look for something smaller. The notice was formal because it had to be, but the process stayed orderly. Future access would be scheduled properly, and Mom and Dad had realistic time and retirement income to find a smaller rental or condo. I had checked that before acting, because I wanted no part of revenge that depended on pretending practical consequences did not exist. Dad acknowledged the notice quietly. Mom called. This time she did not begin with anger. She began with memory. That was more effective. She said I could put my name on whatever paper I wanted, but paper did not own the years inside that house. Then she started naming them. The stairs I had run down as a teenager. The bedroom door where Dad had once marked our heights until Mom made him stop because the pencil lines looked messy. The kitchen where she had taught me to cook, before I was old enough to appreciate being taught. The dining room where Ben had sat during his first Christmas with our family, laughing so hard at one of Greg's terrible impressions that he spilled wine onto a napkin. The Christmas cookies she had rolled with Ellie. She was not inventing any of it. That was what made the conversation difficult. The house was not only her symbol, it was also mine. For 2 weeks, I had focused so heavily on the authority Mom exercised through it that I had almost forgotten the building had held my life before it held her power. As she spoke, I could see rooms more clearly than I wanted to. The narrow strip of kitchen floor where Dad used to stand with his back against the counter while Mom cooked. The front window where we taped paper snowflakes when Heather and I were children. The patch of backyard that never drained properly after heavy rain. None of those memories proved Mom should stay there forever. But they made it impossible to pretend I was removing only an address from her life. I was ending access to a place that had stored decades for all of us. That was why I let her finish. I did not correct every sentence or turn the call into a contest over who had sacrificed more. When she reached Ben, my instinct was to defend the memory before she could use it against me. Instead, I listened long enough to feel what was mine inside her argument. The house had been part of my marriage too. It had been one of the places where Ben was still easy to picture without trying. Selling it meant accepting that memory could survive without the room that contained it. I remembered being 15 and sitting halfway up the staircase after an argument, listening to Dad move around downstairs. I remembered Ben carrying a sleeping 5-year-old Ellie through the front door one Christmas evening because she had refused to admit she was tired. I remembered my mother in younger versions of herself, before every family event seemed to depend on her being right about how it should happen. Mom told me I was destroying something that could never be rebuilt. For once, I did not tell myself she was manipulating me simply because the argument hurt. Part of it was true. If the house sold, those rooms would be gone from us. A stranger might repaint the kitchen. The creaky stair might be repaired. The backyard where Dad once put up a terrible inflatable pool for the grandchildren would become someone else's backyard. I could not own the memories by owning the property. Mom was right about that. But she was wrong about what the truth required me to do. I listened. Then I told her memories were one reason the decision hurt. They were not a reason to keep an arrangement forever. She went quiet. I think she had expected me either to surrender or accuse her of emotional blackmail. My refusal to do either left less room for the usual argument. After we hung up, I sat in my car outside my office for several minutes before going inside. For the first time, I let myself grieve the house before it was gone. That grief did not reverse my decision. It made the decision honest. Greg reacted very differently. Until the formal notice, most of his outrage had been theoretical. He disliked the idea of me selling. He thought I was overreacting, but none of it had reached his daily life yet. The notice changed that. Suddenly, the boxes in Dad's basement, his folding chairs, the hosting schedule, and the convenience of stopping at Mom's between his son's activities all became urgent. He was not trying to expose his priorities. Inconvenience had simply reached him. That was when his anger sharpened. He told me I was affecting everyone now. I remember standing in my laundry room holding a basket when I read that message. Affecting everyone. On Christmas Day, my daughter had needed one ride. Greg had not asked who was affected then. Now his storage and routines were threatened, and suddenly the impact on other people mattered deeply. I did not send him that observation. I did not need to win the exchange. The pattern was visible without my help. He followed with a longer message about how families made decisions together and how I could not act as if my legal ownership meant nobody else had a stake. That last word interested me. Stake. Greg did have one, just not the kind he had imagined. His stake was convenience, a centralized home base, free storage, a reliable place where someone else hosted, a grandmother who kept the structure functioning so he did not have to. For years, the family house had reduced friction in his life. Now he was discovering that benefits feel like rights after you have received them long enough. Heather surprised me. Greg included her in one of his complaints, apparently expecting support. Instead, she told him they could disagree about the sale without pretending Christmas meant nothing. I learned about that exchange because Greg forwarded enough of the thread to prove, in his mind, that Heather was taking my side. She was not. Heather still worried about Dad. She still believed there might have been another way to change the family dynamic without selling. But she had stopped allowing one bad morning to erase what she had admitted about her own choice. For the first time, she pushed back on Greg rather than letting Mom's version become the easiest common position. It was a small shift, but family systems do not always change through speeches. Sometimes they change because one person stops automatically nodding. Mom had spent years relying on everyone's instinct to reduce conflict around her. Heather was beginning not to. Dad already had. Greg noticed the loss before Mom did. I noticed everything. The house still stood exactly where it always had, but the alliances inside it had begun moving. That evening, I found Ellie sitting cross-legged on the rug in the living room, with an old photo album open beside her. She was not searching for anything specific. She had been looking for a picture from a school costume day and ended up flipping backward through older years. There were photographs of Christmas at Mom's house. Ellie in pajamas too big for her. Chloe, wearing a paper crown from a Christmas cracker. Dad asleep in a chair. Ben kneeling beside the tree helping Ellie open something wrapped badly enough that I knew he had done it himself. I sat down beside her. For several minutes, we looked without talking. I had been so careful not to make Ellie responsible for the property decision that I had avoided asking what the house meant to her at all. That suddenly seemed like another form of deciding for her. So I asked one simple question. When you think about Grandma's house, what do you miss? Ellie did not answer immediately. She turned another page. The cinnamon rolls. I smiled. Then she added the squeaky stair near the upstairs bathroom, because Chloe used to try to step over it at night. She missed the cabinet where Grandpa kept the candy he pretended Molet'd not know about. She missed sitting with Chloe under the dining table when they were younger, even though they were too big to do that now. She missed Grandpa letting her pick the music while he washed dishes. She missed Mom's cookie cutters shaped like stars and bells. She named pieces, people, smells, jokes, a stair, a cabinet, food. Not once did she say she missed everyone being together. I had expected that phrase because it was the phrase I would have used. The family all together. That was what I had believed I was preserving. Listening to Ellie, I realized how much of that need belonged to me. She had not been clinging to one giant structure. She had been collecting relationships and small memories inside it. I had been the one insisting they were inseparable. I closed the album gently. I told her Grandma and Grandpa would eventually be moving, but the adults were handling it, and none of it was her responsibility. She nodded. Then I said something I should have said much earlier. She did not have to see anybody just because the adults thought she should. If she wanted to see someone, we could talk about it. If she did not, she could say that too. Ellie looked at the album again. I expected her to mention Chloe. Instead, she said Grandpa. The answer tightened something in my chest. Dad had failed her. He had admitted it, but she still loved him. Both things could be true. Okay, I said. She rubbed her thumb over the edge of a photograph, where Dad was wearing a ridiculous paper Christmas hat. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, just not at Grandma's house. I looked at her. She did not sound angry. She sounded certain. And in that moment, my 11-year-old daughter did something I had spent 6 years believing was impossible. She separated a person from the institution around him. Grandpa did not have to mean Grandma. Grandma did not have to mean the house. The house did not have to mean the family. And family did not have to arrive as one package I was responsible for keeping intact. The first person Ellie asked to see was my father. Dad had failed Ellie on Christmas, and still mattered to her after 11 years of ordinary love. I no longer needed to resolve that contradiction for her. I told Ellie only what she needed to know. Grandma and Grandpa would eventually move. The adults were handling the property. None of it was her responsibility, and she could choose whom she felt ready to see. I expected that last part to feel harsh when I said it. Instead, it felt obvious. Ellie listened while sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal in front of her. By then, she was much closer to herself physically. She had returned to school on a gradual schedule and complained about missed assignments with enough irritation that I considered it excellent news. The careful hand that had hovered near her abdomen for weeks appeared less often. When I asked whether she still wanted to see Grandpa, she nodded, but not at Grandma's house. That condition did not change. Ellie chose the library cafe. I gave Dad the time and place and told him the visit would be short. Everything after that showing up, what he said, whether he defended Mom was his responsibility. That sounded almost embarrassingly basic when I thought about it. Yet for years I had done so much invisible work around the family that letting another adult carry his own emotional responsibility felt like learning not to catch something when it fell. Dad arrived 10 minutes early. I saw him through the cafe window before Ellie did. He sat at a small table with 2 paper cups and nothing else. No gift bag, no oversized stuffed animal, no attempt to purchase his way past discomfort. When Ellie spotted him, her steps slowed slightly. I felt the impulse to put my hand on her shoulder and encourage her forward. I stopped myself. She was allowed to hesitate. Dad stood when we approached. He looked at Ellie first, then at me. He did not reach for a hug. That mattered. He had spent most of his adult life believing gentleness meant reducing discomfort as quickly as possible. In another version of this moment, he might have tried to make everything normal before Ellie was ready. Instead, he let the awkwardness exist. We sat. I remained nearby, but did not dominate the conversation. Dad asked about school, and Ellie answered. He mentioned the astronomy book she had once left at his house, then seemed to realize that referring to the house might complicate the moment and stopped himself. There were small silences. Nobody rushed to fill all of them. Then Dad placed both hands around his cup and looked directly at Ellie. I could have come. I didn't. I'm sorry. That was all. No explanation about Grandma. No mention of Christmas stress. No sentence beginning with but. He did not say he thought somebody else would go. He did not tell her how terrible he felt, which would have required Ellie to comfort him. He simply named the choice. Ellie looked down at the table. For a few seconds, she traced one fingertip along the edge of a napkin. Then she said, "Okay." It was not forgiveness. It was not rejection. It was the amount of response she had. Dad accepted it. That may have been the first genuinely useful thing he had done since Christmas. The rest of the visit stayed ordinary. They talked about a science project. Dad complained mildly about a new coffee maker he could not figure out. Ellie corrected him about something involving planets, and he let her. When we left, he did not ask when he could see her again. He told her he would be glad to if she wanted to. The distinction was small enough that most people would have missed it. I noticed the small things because there was nothing dramatic left for him to hide behind. He had bought himself plain coffee and Ellie hot chocolate, but he did not push the cup toward her when she barely touched it. When she shifted in her chair and looked toward me, he stopped talking instead of trying to hold her attention. Once, a group of children passed close behind us, and the noise made Ellie lose the thread of what she was saying. Dad waited until she picked it up again. Before Christmas, I would never have counted patience in seconds like that. Now I understood that reliability was often made of moments too small to photograph. At one point, Ellie mentioned a school project she had missed while she was sick. Dad asked when it was due, then caught himself before turning the question into an offer he might not be able to keep. He simply told her the model she described sounded difficult. Ellie rolled her eyes and said it was, and for the first time since we sat down, her shoulders loosened. The conversation became ordinary enough that I could look away from them for a few seconds without feeling I was supervising a negotiation. When Dad stood to leave, he gathered his own cup and napkin and carried them to the trash. He did not hover beside Ellie, waiting for a hug. He gave her space to put on her coat, said goodbye from where he stood, and let her choose the distance between them. She gave him a small wave. He accepted that too. I did not. On the drive home, Ellie stared out the window for a while. I asked only whether she was okay. She said yes. Then, after a minute, she said Grandpa looked sad. I told her adults could be sad about consequences without children needing to fix the sadness. She nodded and changed the subject. I let her. It was not a reconciliation. It was one small act done correctly, which was a better beginning. Heather approached differently. She texted me first instead of contacting Ellie directly. She asked whether Ellie might want to see Chloe and the other cousins somewhere low pressure. The wording caught my attention. Might want, not should. Not they miss her. Not it would be good for everyone. Heather had begun learning the difference between invitation and pressure. I asked Ellie. Her answer came faster this time. Yes. Then, immediately, the same condition. Not at Grandma's house. Heather did not negotiate. She did not ask why. She suggested a quiet board game cafe on a weekend afternoon and said she could bring Chloe. That was all. Heather's lack of argument mattered more than another apology speech. For years, Mom's house had been the default container for cousins, siblings, grandparents, family delivered as one package. Now those relationships were beginning to exist separately. The cafe was small and warm, with shelves of games along one wall and the smell of coffee and toasted sandwiches drifting from the counter. Nothing about it carried family history. That was useful. Ellie and Chloe picked a game, changed their minds, chose another, and within 10 minutes were arguing over rules as if Christmas had never happened. I sat with Heather a few tables away. For most of the afternoon, we did not discuss Mom. That was important too. If every repaired relationship had to revolve around what Judith had done, then Judith would still occupy the center. Heather asked how Ellie was doing at school. I asked about Chloe. We talked about ordinary things long enough that I almost forgot we were practicing a new kind of family. At one point, Ellie laughed loudly enough that several people turned. She looked like an 11-year-old enjoying time with her cousin. No one had cooked Sunday dinner or called them home, and the relationship survived perfectly well without Mom's dining table. The girls eventually chose a cooperative mystery game and immediately stopped cooperating. Chloe wanted to read every instruction first. Ellie insisted she understood the rules after half a page. They spent 10 minutes accusing each other of moving the wrong card, then discovered they had both misunderstood the same symbol. Their argument ended in the kind of helpless laughter that makes children fold forward over a table. I watched Ellie wipe tears from the corner of one eye and realized I had not heard that particular laugh since before the hospital. Halfway through the game, Heather's younger child needed something from the counter at the same moment her phone began vibrating. She glanced at the screen, silenced it, and got up. It was nothing heroic. She bought another drink, found extra napkins, came back, and sat down again. But the afternoon contained the ordinary interruptions she had once treated as reasons not to move. Nobody was asking her to prove anything. She was simply handling what was in front of her without turning inconvenience into a moral argument. When Ellie and Chloe wanted another 20 minutes to finish the game, Heather checked the time and said yes, even though it meant leaving later than she had planned. I noticed because on Christmas morning, 25 minutes had been enough to make helping feel unreasonable. Here, nobody announced the comparison. The girls finished their game, lost badly, and asked to play again another day. Heather seemed to notice the same thing. She watched the girls for a while and said quietly that Chloe had been asking why everyone could not just meet somewhere else sometimes. There was no accusation in it, only surprise at how simple the solution sounded once a child said it. I nearly laughed. Adults could build entire systems around traditions children were willing to adjust in 5 minutes. When we left, Heather hugged me briefly. I returned it. Neither of us called it reconciliation. That word was too large for what had happened. We had spent an afternoon in the same room, without requiring Mom's house to make us sisters. For now, that was enough. Dottie appeared that evening because she had somehow ended up with a package addressed to a man one street over and had decided the postal service was collapsing. She stood in my entryway, holding the box like evidence in a federal case. Ellie, who was stretched across the couch reading, reminded her that the address clearly said Walnut Court, not our street. Dottie responded that she was perfectly capable of reading and then spent 5 minutes explaining why the numbering system in the neighborhood had been designed by a person with no respect for logic. I leaned against the wall, listening to Dottie complain about mail while Ellie rolled her eyes. Nobody turned the moment into a discussion about Grandpa, the move, or forgiveness. It was ordinary, which was exactly what I loved about it. Ellie rolled her eyes at me when Dottie started telling a completely unrelated story about a package of garden stakes delivered to the wrong house 3 summers earlier. I had never seen my daughter look more comfortable. Safety, I was learning, did not always feel profound. Sometimes it felt boring enough to be mildly annoying. After Dottie finally left to continue her investigation of the neighborhood mail system, I stood in the kitchen thinking about Mom. For the first time since Christmas, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding in a different form. What if she apologized tomorrow? Not the half apology attached to a gift. Not, "I'm sorry you were hurt." A real apology. What if she called Ellie and said she had been wrong? Would I stop the sale? The answer came before the guilt did. No. That surprised me less than it would have 2 weeks earlier. By then, the house and the apology belonged to separate questions. An apology could affect whether Ellie wanted to see Grandma. Consistent behavior could affect whether that relationship rebuilt. Neither one changed the fact that the housing arrangement had become something I no longer wanted to support. If I told Mom that an apology could save the house, the apology would become currency. If I told Ellie that forgiving Grandma might keep the family home, I would place an adult property decision onto an 11-year-old child. Both were wrong. The house could not become a reward for repentance. It also could not remain a punishment. I withdrew once I felt emotionally satisfied. The decision had to stand on its own logic. The old arrangement was ending. What happened between Ellie and Mom would develop separately. That clarity took something out of the conflict. Mom could no longer bargain with the same tools. Neither could I. A few days later, Dad called me. His tone was careful, but not because he was asking for something. He and Mom had started looking at smaller places. I waited. The old version of me would immediately have offered to send listings, make calls, compare neighborhoods, check commute times, even though neither of them commuted anymore. I did none of it. Dad did not ask me to. He told me they had viewed 2 condos and 1 rental. All were within what they could afford on their retirement income. None would leave them destitute. None were remotely as large as the house. Mom hated all 3. The first had a kitchen she called claustrophobic. The second did not have enough room for a full dining table. The rental had a living room she described as impossible for Christmas. I listened. Dad sounded tired, not helpless. There was a difference. He had begun gathering information himself. He had spoken to leasing offices. He was learning what utilities were included and how much storage they actually needed. The problem was not that there was nowhere for them to go. The problem was that every realistic place required them to become 2 retired people living in a smaller home. Dad told me he had started measuring furniture before they went to viewings. The old dining table was the first problem. It had leaves stored in a closet and enough scratches underneath to document 3 decades of holiday meals. But there was no sensible reason to force it into a room built for 4 people. He had said as much to Mom. She answered by naming Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, birthdays, every occasion on which the table had ever been full. Dad did not ask me to settle the argument. He went home and measured it again. He had also begun sorting things that had been easy to ignore in a basement. Duplicate serving dishes, boxes of children's books nobody had opened in years, a broken lamp Greg once promised to repair. He sounded almost embarrassed when he admitted how much of the house had been used to postpone decisions. A smaller place would make those decisions unavoidable. I understood then that downsizing was not only a loss of square footage, It was an end to the family habit of letting the house absorb whatever nobody wanted to deal with yet. What mattered to me was that Dad was doing the work himself. He was calling, measuring, sorting, and tolerating Mom's frustration without turning to me to make the new reality more comfortable. For a man who had spent years reducing conflict by moving it onto someone else, that was a form of change I could actually see. Mom had spent decades being the woman everyone returned to. Downsizing threatened that identity more than it threatened her comfort. I could hear it in every objection Dad repeated. Too small for everyone. No place for the cousins to sleep. Where would Thanksgiving happen? What if all the children came at once? The questions assumed all the children would still come at once. That assumption was becoming less certain every week. I asked Dad how he felt about the smaller places. He said one of the condos was fine. Fine. Coming from my father, that was nearly enthusiasm. He liked that maintenance would be simpler. He liked the elevator. He liked not having to worry about the yard. Then he admitted Mom had barely looked at the bedrooms before asking how many people could fit around the dining area. I stared out my kitchen window while he talked. Until then, I had still been carrying a small piece of fear that perhaps I had misjudged the property issue. Maybe Mom's panic really was mostly about physical security. Maybe, underneath the arguments about family, she was simply an aging woman terrified of losing the home where she had spent most of her adult life. That fear was real. I did not want to mock it, but it was not the whole thing. Dad confirmed that without meaning to. He told me Mom had walked through each place not asking whether she could live there, but whether everyone else could gather there. That distinction changed the shape of her resistance. I asked whether he wanted help. Dad was quiet for a moment, then he said no. Not because he was angry, because they needed to do this themselves. I respected him for that. For years, our family had made things easier for Mom, until ease itself became entitlement. Dad was finally choosing not to make me responsible for the consequence. He said they would keep looking, then his voice dropped slightly. There was something he had begun to understand. Your mother isn't scared of having nowhere to live, he said. I waited. Dad had spent most of his life translating Mom into kinder language. This time, he did not. She's scared that wherever we go next won't be the place everyone has to come back to. Frank's sentence stayed with me long after we ended the call. Your mother isn't scared of having nowhere to live. She's scared that wherever we go next won't be the place everyone has to come back to. I kept Frank's observation to myself and watched what happened instead of turning it into proof against Judith. By February, the difference between losing shelter and losing position had become difficult not to see. Dad and Mom continued looking at places they could realistically afford. Dad kept me informed without asking me to participate. That boundary held. I left the listings, leasing calls, and floor plans to them. I had spent enough years making transitions easier for everyone around me. This one belonged to them. The options Dad described were ordinary. A 2-bedroom condo with an elevator and a small balcony. A rental in a quiet complex not far from their doctor's and grocery store. Another place with enough room for a dining table, just not the table Mom had used for decades. They were not being pushed toward danger. They were downsizing. Mom spoke about each place as though downsizing were a personal humiliation. The condo was cramped. The rental felt temporary. One kitchen had almost no counter space. Another living room was fine for 2 people, but what happens when everyone comes? The same question kept surfacing. What happens when everyone comes? Mom worried less about whether a place was safe or affordable than about where everyone would sit at Thanksgiving or Christmas. Meanwhile, the family was already learning to meet without one room, one table, or one person directing traffic. Ellie had seen Grandpa at the library cafe. She had spent time with Chloe somewhere neutral. Heather and I had managed to sit together without Mom acting as the reason. None of those relationships had collapsed. They had simply moved. Mom seemed unable to imagine movement without interpreting it as loss. Dad told me she walked through the smaller places, looking less at where their furniture might fit than at what would no longer fit around them. I did not tell him his earlier sentence had been right. He knew. By then, Ellie had returned to a mostly normal school routine. The surgery belonged to December rather than the present. She was still 11, still several weeks away from her April birthday, and the physical caution that had followed her home from the hospital had faded. Her backpack was back on the kitchen floor, where I repeatedly told her not to leave it. She argued about homework. She forgot to bring a water bottle to school twice in 1 week. Recovery, I discovered, could look wonderfully irritating. The family conflict moved in the opposite direction. As the March 31st move date became less abstract, the story Mom had been telling began slipping out of her control. For weeks, I had heard variations of the same sentence through relatives. Audrey was taking Mom's house. Audrey was forcing her parents out. Audrey had used some old financial arrangement to turn one Christmas argument into a real estate punishment. I rarely corrected anyone beyond the minimum facts. Explaining myself to every person who heard Mom's version would only put me back in the role I was trying to leave. Heather made a different choice. It happened during a broader family conversation Mom had initiated because she wanted everyone to understand how unnecessary the move was becoming. I joined because Dad asked me to, but I went into it with one rule for myself. I would not litigate Christmas or perform the entire history of the house for an audience. Mom began exactly where I expected. She spoke about the home she and Dad had built, the decades they had lived there, and the sudden upheaval my decision had created. She used the word sudden more than once. Then someone referred to me taking over the house. Heather interrupted. Not loudly, not angrily. She simply said, "Audrey bought it 5 years ago." The conversation went quiet. In a way that family conversations rarely do. Someone asked what she meant. Heather repeated it. Not helped, not refinanced, bought. She explained, briefly, that Mom and Dad had remained there under an arrangement after the sale. I did not ask Heather to do that. A month earlier, she had been one of the people calling me confused, because she herself did not know the truth. Now, she was the one refusing to let the softened version continue. Several relatives reacted with genuine surprise. They had heard some form of the refinance story too. Nobody needed exact numbers. Nobody asked to see documents. The shock came from realizing that the phrase, Mom and Dad's house, had hidden a legal reality most of them had never known. Mom responded quickly. She said private finances were nobody else's business. That was true. Then she said she had never lied. That was where truth became more complicated. According to Mom, nobody had ever asked her who held the title. Audrey had allowed everyone to continue calling it the family home. Audrey had come to holidays there. Audrey had never corrected anybody. Therefore, in Mom's reasoning, I had participated in the story just as much as she had. Part of that was true. I had stayed silent, protected her dignity, and called it Grandma's house in front of Ellie. Mom had taken that courtesy one step further and treated my refusal to embarrass her as surrender as though kindness were a permanent waiver. I listened to her and suddenly understood why the realtor's call had enraged her so deeply. It was not only that I might sell, it was that I had reintroduced a fact she believed my silence had buried. Dad had been quiet through most of the conversation. That was normal for him. What happened next was not. Mom said that if the arrangement had truly mattered to me, I should have been honest from the beginning instead of letting her live there for years, as though it were still her home. Dad spoke before I could. He said the silence had been his idea. I looked at my phone as though I could see him through it. He told everyone that after the sale, he had asked me not to emphasize ownership because Mom had felt humiliated. I had agreed to protect her dignity. Then he said something I had never expected him to say in front of her. We got used to Audrey's kindness and started treating it like something she owed us. Mom went silent. Dad's apology to Ellie had cost him pride, Contradicting Mom in front of the family cost him peace at home. For years he had softened or redirected her discomfort. Now he had contradicted the version she needed everyone to believe. I could hear something change in the silence. Mom asked whether he was really taking my side. Dad did not answer in those terms. He said there should not be sides to facts. The conversation did not explode. That almost made it more powerful. No one shouted. No one stormed off. Mom simply lost the one thing she had always been able to count on from Dad: automatic validation. Afterward, Heather called me. She sounded shaken, not triumphant. She told me Mom had called her separately and accused her of humiliating the family. Heather said she still did not know whether selling had been the only possible answer. I appreciated that she did not pretend otherwise. "But I'm not saying you stole her house anymore," she said. That was enough. Change did not require everyone to agree with me. It required them to stop repeating something they now knew was false. Greg struggled with that more than Heather. As packing started, his complaints became increasingly specific. The boxes in the basement needed somewhere to go. His son had toys at Grandma's house. There would be no convenient place to stop between activities. Nobody had volunteered to host the same way Mom had. Who was going to keep the long folding table? Where would holiday storage go? He spoke about the house as infrastructure. That was what it had been for him. A free extension of his own life. I used to respond to every complaint as though my job were to persuade him that my decision was morally justified. By March, I stopped. If Greg asked where his boxes should go, I told him he needed to collect them before the move. If he complained that his apartment did not have enough storage, I did not solve it. If he asked who would host Easter someday, I said I did not know. The answers felt almost rude at first, because they were so unlike the family language I had grown up with. We did not know who would host. We did not know whether everyone would attend. We did not know whether one central house would ever exist again. Not knowing was not disaster. It was simply the absence of Mom deciding in advance. The thing Greg mentioned least was Ellie. He did not completely ignore Christmas. He had admitted his failure in his own limited way. But when the practical consequences became real, his energy went toward what he was losing: storage, routine, convenience, a home base he had never paid to maintain. I no longer needed to make him understand why that mattered. His priorities were answering for him. Mom's next argument reached somewhere deeper. It happened during a phone call in early March, after another scheduled house visit had forced her to spend part of an afternoon elsewhere. Everything had been arranged in advance. No one had entered without notice. There was no legal ambush. Still, Mom described every showing as an invasion. She told me strangers were walking through rooms where her children had grown up. I understood that grief more than she expected. Those rooms had raised me too. Then she said Ben would be ashamed of what I was doing. For a moment, I could not breathe normally. She had never used him this directly before. That was why it worked. Ben had loved family gatherings. He had liked my father. He had tolerated Mom's need to control dinner schedules with more humor than I did. At Christmas, he had been the person who carried chairs in from the garage and made fun of Greg's taste in music. He had loved seeing Ellie surrounded by cousins. After he died, those memories became part of why I fought so hard to preserve everything. Mom knew that. She told me Ben had valued family and would hate watching me dismantle what remained. The old fear rose immediately, because Ben's death was the reason I had spent 6 years preserving the family center. Then I remembered what mattered. He had never lived through this Christmas or faced the facts I had now. Letting Mom use his memory to decide for me would not honor him. It would turn him into a vote she could cast after his death. "I loved Ben," I said. "I'm not going to make decisions for him about a situation he never lived to see." That was all. No speech. No argument about what Ben would really have wanted. I refused the entire premise. Mom did not like that. She said grief had changed me. Maybe it had. Losing Ben had made me desperate to preserve people. Christmas had finally made me ask whether preservation alone deserved to be called love. By mid-March, the house had visibly changed. Dad began packing. Not everything. Just the things that could be boxed without making daily life impossible. Books disappeared from shelves. Closets opened. Greg finally collected some of his belongings, after Dad gave him a deadline. Appointments connected to the property happened with advance notice. The move date no longer sounded like something theoretical at the end of a document. March 31st was coming. That was when Mom's calls increased. Some days there were 3, sometimes 4. One would be about a cabinet she did not think should be included. I saw the change myself one afternoon when I went over at an agreed time. The entryway that had once been crowded with holiday decorations held 3 taped boxes and a stack of flattened cardboard. One wall in the living room looked strangely pale, where framed photographs had already been removed. Dad had labels on boxes in handwriting so large I could read them from across the room. Kitchen, books, keep, donate. Mom stood beside the dining table with a roll of packing paper and spent several minutes arguing with nobody in particular about whether the serving platter from Heather's wedding shower could possibly fit in the condo cabinets. Ellie was not with me. Mom asked once how school was going, listened to my short answer, and then immediately returned to the question of which furniture could survive the move. A few weeks earlier, she had accepted Ellie declining another visit with a tight, wounded silence. That afternoon, the possibility that one china cabinet might not fit consumed 20 minutes. I did not point out the imbalance. I carried a small box Dad asked me to move out of the walkway, set it where he indicated, and let the room speak for itself. The house was beginning to look less like a permanent family institution, and more like what it had always physically been. Rooms full of objects that could be packed, sold, donated, or carried somewhere else. Mom reacted to every emptied shelf, as though a piece of authority were being removed with it. Another about whether an upcoming appointment could be changed. Another about how impossible it was to pack decades of life into a smaller space. Then she would call Dad, then Heather, then me again. Around the same time, she asked about Ellie, only occasionally. The contrast became hard to miss. Ellie declined visits, and Mom was hurt, sometimes defensive. But as boxes filled the house, and March 31st approached, Mom's calls multiplied. Ellie's distance upset her. The physical loss of the house reorganized her days. I did not need to explain the comparison aloud. Even Dad seemed to see it. Heather certainly did. Mom was losing 2 things at once: her granddaughter's automatic closeness and the house's automatic centrality. Only one of those losses seemed capable of making her reorganize an entire day. I did not tell Ellie any of this. She was not responsible for understanding Grandma's psychology. Her job was school, friends, deciding whether she wanted pasta or tacos, and complaining that I made her put her phone away at dinner. By then, we talked about Mom only when Ellie raised the subject. One evening she did. She was sitting at the counter while I put groceries away. Her lavender headphones, the Christmas gift from Mom, rested around her neck. That image alone contained more contradiction than any explanation I could have given her. She still used the gift. She still loved it. She still did not want to go to Grandma's house. Ellie asked whether Grandma was mad at her. I told her adults sometimes felt hurt when relationships changed, but that did not make those feelings a child's job to repair. She nodded. Then she asked whether Grandma might say sorry. I said she might. Ellie became quiet. I put milk into the refrigerator and waited. The question came while she was staring at a magnet on the freezer. If Grandma says sorry, do I have to go back? I turned around. Back where? To her house, like before. There was no anger in her face. That was what stayed with me. She was not asking whether forgiveness was morally required. She was asking whether an apology would obligate her to resume the old arrangement. Whether Grandma saying the right words would mean Sunday dinners, long visits, Automatic hugs, Christmas expectations, all of it returning at once. The package again. Person, title, house, relationship, tradition. For years I had treated those things as inseparable. Ellie had learned to fear that one apology might snap them all back together. "No," I said. One word. She looked at me. I told her an apology was something she could hear if she wanted to. It did not require her to pretend nothing had happened. It did not require her to visit anywhere. It did not require her to feel close before she was ready. She considered that. Then she asked if she had to hear the apology at all. I told her no. That answer seemed to matter even more. 2 days later, Mom contacted me. For once, the message was not about packing, access, the move date, Greg's boxes, or the house. She asked to speak to Ellie in person. I read the message slowly. For months, almost every argument in our family had revolved around whether I had the right to change the future of a house. Now the house was no longer the most important decision in front of me. I showed Ellie the message and told her she did not have to answer immediately. She read it once, then set my phone down. I gave her no verdict about whether Grandma deserved a chance, or what accepting or refusing would mean. This choice belonged to her in a way the property never had. For months, everyone had argued about whether I had the right to change the house. Now Ellie was about to decide whether Judith still had a place in her life at all. Ellie did not answer Mom's request right away. For the rest of that evening, she behaved almost exactly as she had before I showed her the message. She finished homework at the kitchen table, complained that the pasta sauce tasted different even though I had used the same jar I always bought, and disappeared upstairs with her lavender headphones around her neck. I let her go upstairs without following, one of the harder changes I had made since Christmas. My old instinct was to move toward Ellie with explanations before she had time to sit with hurt. This time, I waited. The property was an adult responsibility. Whether she wanted to sit in a room with her grandmother belonged to her. The next afternoon, Ellie came into my office while I was finishing work and stood beside the desk until I looked up. She said she would meet Grandma. Then she added that she did not want to do it at Grandma's house. I nodded. She did not want a restaurant either. Too many people. After thinking for a while, she chose our house. That surprised me at first, but I understood once she explained it in the simple way. Children often explain things adults spend weeks complicating. If she wanted Grandma to leave, this was the place where Grandma would have to leave. Not her. That was enough reason for me. I told Mom the meeting would happen at my house. It would be brief. No Dad, no Heather, no Greg, no surprise relatives waiting outside. Ellie would not be expected to hug her, and if Ellie wanted the conversation to stop, it would stop. Mom disliked the conditions. I could tell from the pause before she agreed. But she agreed. For once, that mattered more than whether she liked it. The meeting happened in late March, with less than a week left before Mom and Dad were scheduled to move. By then, cardboard boxes had begun replacing furniture at their house. Dad had told me they had chosen a smaller place they could afford, though Mom still described the move as something being done to her rather than something she was participating in. I kept all of that away from the conversation. This was not about March 31st. It was about December 25th. Mom arrived 5 minutes early. I saw her car stop in front of the house through the living room window. Ellie was sitting at one end of the couch with her feet tucked beneath her. She had changed shirts twice before Mom arrived, and then insisted she had not been nervous. I did not correct her. Mom stood on the porch for a few seconds before ringing the bell. When I opened the door, I noticed she was carrying nothing. No bag, no flowers, no replacement gift. I was relieved. The lavender headphones had already taught me enough about how easily affection could arrive in forms that avoided the real issue. Mom stepped inside and looked toward Ellie. For 1 second, the old grandmother instinct appeared on her face. The quick warmth, the urge to move forward. Then she stopped herself. Ellie did not stand. That seemed to surprise Mom more than I expected. In the old version of our family, children stood when grandparents entered. They hugged. Adults moved through familiar rooms, according to familiar roles. Here, nobody gave Mom a script. She sat in the chair across from the couch. I stayed nearby, not between them, but close enough that Ellie knew she could end the visit by looking at me. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The silence was not dramatic. It was uncomfortable. There is a difference. Mom had always been good at controlling uncomfortable rooms. She filled them with plans, food, questions, instructions. Give her an empty table, and she would assign seats before anybody had asked where to sit. This room gave her nowhere to organize. Eventually, she looked at Ellie and said, "I never meant to make you feel unwanted." The sentence was almost an apology. Almost. I watched Ellie's face. No reaction. Mom continued. She explained that by Christmas morning, the medical emergency had been over. Ellie was being discharged, which meant the doctors believed she was safe enough to go home. The family had already spent days worrying, changing schedules, visiting the hospital, bringing things, waiting for updates. She said everyone had been exhausted. She said she believed the hospital had transportation options. She said she thought I was asking the whole family to reorganize Christmas again when there were other ways for us to get home. The explanation was calmer than the original messenger message. Kinder. More reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. For years, reasonable versions had been enough to close every conflict. I could hear how easily the story might have ended if Ellie had been younger. Grandma was stressed. Grandma thought you were safe. Grandma didn't realize. Everybody still loves you. But Ellie was 11 now, old enough to remember the lobby, old enough to know what a scene indicator meant, old enough to understand that 4 adults could all believe somebody else should move. Mom finished by saying she would never intentionally make Ellie feel like she did not belong. That was when Ellie finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, not trembling, not angry. I didn't need everybody. I needed one person to come. Mom stopped. The room changed. I had heard Ellie say versions of that idea before, but never to Mom. There was nothing sophisticated in Ellie's sentence, which was why Mom could not argue around it. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I had spent months hearing people turn Christmas into something large. A family emergency. A conflict over priorities. A disagreement about how much attention one household should receive. My daughter had just made it small again. Mom looked down at her hands. For several seconds, she did not say anything. I noticed Ellie watching her carefully, not with the furious expression adults sometimes expect from hurt children. Ellie looked cautious. That hurt more. Anger assumes the relationship can survive contact. Caution measures every movement. The furnace clicked on beneath the silence. A car moved past the front window, its tires hissing against damp pavement. Mom rubbed her thumb once across the side of her index finger, a small nervous habit I remembered from childhood whenever she had been forced to sit through an answer she disliked. Ellie did not fill the quiet for her. She shifted one foot beneath the other on the couch and waited. I realized I was waiting too, not for an apology yet, but to see whether Mom could remain in the room, after losing the argument, without immediately rebuilding it in another form. For once, nobody offered her an easier exit. Mom finally said she had thought there were other options. That part was true. The hospital could have arranged transportation eventually. I could have used a rideshare. We had not been physically trapped. Before I could answer, Ellie did. Mom found one. Mrs. Klein came. That was all she said. Mom looked at me. I let the silence stay between us. Dottie had not disproved that other transportation existed. She had simply treated a manageable need as manageable and asked which entrance. Mom stared at the floor for a few seconds. I could almost see her searching for the next argument. Normally, this was where she found the qualifying sentence. But Audrey could have but the hospital, but Heather had children. But everyone was tired. Nothing came. The silence was different from the one at the beginning of the visit. That silence had belonged to discomfort. This one belonged to the absence of a defense. Mom looked back at Ellie. Her face had changed slightly. Not dramatically. She did not suddenly understand every pattern that had brought us here. She did not become a different person in one afternoon. But something in her certainty had cracked. She asked Ellie whether she had been expecting Grandpa to come. Ellie shrugged first, then said she thought Grandpa might. Mom nodded. She asked whether Ellie had thought Aunt Heather might come. Another small shrug. Maybe. Mom looked down again. I understood what was happening. For months, Mom had defended Christmas through her own intention. Now she was hearing it from inside the lobby, an 11-year-old watching headlights and wondering which familiar person might come. Her face changed. It was not enough to undo anything, but it was real. Eventually she said she was sorry. The apology was not perfect. I did not expect it to be. She said she should not have sent the message she sent. She said she had not understood that Ellie was sitting there watching the family thread and waiting for someone specific to arrive. I almost interrupted that part. The hurt did not depend on Ellie seeing the screen, but I stopped myself. This was not my apology to grade. Ellie listened. When Mom finished, she said thank you. Nothing more. Mom looked surprised again. She had apologized. Some part of her clearly expected the relationship to move immediately. Not all the way back, but somewhere. A hug, a promise, an invitation, something visible. Ellie gave her none. The silence made Mom shift in the chair. Then she looked at me. That was when the house entered the room. Not because I brought it there, because Mom did. She said that if we were finally talking honestly, she wanted to know whether any of this changed what was happening with the house. I had expected the question. Months earlier, it might have angered me enough to end the visit. Now I understood why it mattered. For Mom, apology had always been the bridge back to normal. Conflict, apology, Sunday dinner, Christmas, the table filled again. I no longer believed restoration had to mean returning to the same arrangement. I told her the house and Ellie's trust were separate. Mom's expression tightened. She said she had apologized. I know. I kept my voice low. I explained that the rental arrangement was ending because I no longer wanted the family's central structure to depend on one house I owned, while everyone behaved as though Mom controlled it. That decision had stopped being about getting an apology weeks ago. If I made the house conditional on the right words, then the apology would become a transaction. Say enough. Keep the house. I did not want that. And I refused to let Ellie grow up, believing her comfort could be traded for adult property decisions. Mom looked at Ellie. I saw the thought cross her face before she said anything. If Ellie forgave her, perhaps that should count. I stopped that gently. Ellie doesn't decide the house. Mom looked back at me. She decides Ellie. I let the sentence sit. I meant it more carefully than it sounded. Ellie decided her own access, her own comfort, whether she wanted another visit, whether she wanted a hug, whether she wanted Grandma at an event. She did not control adult finances, tenancy dates, property sales, or the lives of two grandparents. I had spent years giving adults too much power through family titles. I was not going to correct that by giving a child power she should never have had to carry. Mom asked what future contact would look like. I told her I did not know yet. That answer frustrated her. She wanted rules, a schedule, a path back. I had none to offer. Trust was not a checklist. I told her I would not force Ellie into a permanent cutoff if Ellie wanted to see her. But I also would not force closeness because she was Grandma. Mom's eyes moved toward Ellie. For the first time in the whole conversation, I thought she understood that the consequence in front of her was larger than losing a dining room. The house had an ending date, March 31st. Ellie did not. There was no document telling Mom when trust would return. No 60-day period. No guaranteed renewal. Being grandma no longer provided automatic access. Her future relationship depended on what happened next, and Ellie would be allowed to notice. Mom sat with that. Then, cautiously, she asked Ellie whether she would be willing to see her again sometime. Ellie thought before answering. Maybe. Mom flinched almost invisibly. I saw it. So did Ellie. Neither of us rescued her from it. Maybe it was not punishment. It was the truth. Before Mom left, she stood near the front door and seemed uncertain whether to say goodbye from there or approach Ellie. She chose not to approach. She told Ellie she was glad she looked healthy again. Ellie thanked her. Then Mom left. No hug. No dramatic reconciliation. No final line about family. The front door closed. I stood with my hand still on the knob for several seconds. The house was quiet. I expected Ellie to say something profound. Instead, she asked whether she could have a snack. I laughed before I could stop myself. Not because anything was funny. Because the conversation adults had spent months circling had ended. For Ellie, with hunger, I made her toast. Ellie had said what she needed to say, so I let the moment end, without turning Mom into another lesson we had to analyze together. Over the next few days, Mom did not call repeatedly. That was new. She sent Ellie one short message, saying she had appreciated being allowed to visit. Ellie answered with a heart reaction hours later. Maybe the heart meant affection. Maybe politeness. Maybe nothing more than the way 11-year-olds use phones. I let it remain small. The move date kept approaching. Dad continued packing. Mom complained less to me, though I knew from Heather that she had not suddenly accepted everything. Greg remained irritated. Heather stayed out of most of it. For once, the family was not treating one emotional conversation as a reset button. That felt healthier than forgiveness would have, if forgiveness required pretending nothing had changed. A few days before the end of March, Nina called. I recognized her name on the screen while Ellie was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework. The timing felt almost too neat, but life sometimes puts separate decisions beside one another without making them the same decision. The conversation with Mom had ended. Now the property returned. Nina told me there was a credible offer. The marketing and scheduled access had done what they were supposed to do. The buyers could work with a closing after Mom and Dad moved out. The numbers were reasonable. Nothing about the offer required me to make a rushed decision that afternoon. She summarized the important parts and stopped. No excitement, no congratulations, no suggestion that I had won anything. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Do you want me to accept the offer? I did not answer immediately. Across the room, Ellie was chewing the end of a pencil while staring at a math problem. She had no idea what Nina had just asked. I looked at her. Not for permission. That was never going to be hers to give. I looked at her because I wanted to remember what had changed since Christmas. On December 25th, I had contacted Nina while anger was still hot enough to make action feel simple. Since then, I had heard Dad admit his silence, Heather admit convenience. Greg exposed the limits of his concern. Mom showed both genuine love and genuine entitlement. I had watched Ellie build relationships outside the house. I had watched the family survive a Sunday dinner nobody automatically attended. I had learned that selling would cost me memories too. I had separated apology from consequence. The house no longer represented revenge. It represented an arrangement I was no longer willing to maintain. Nina waited. I looked at Ellie one more time. Then I answered. Yes, I told Nina. The word came out quietly, followed not by victory but by the weight of finality. Nina confirmed that she would move forward with the offer and summarized the next practical steps in a few sentences. The buyers were prepared to close after Mom and Dad moved out. The dates worked. Nothing had to happen overnight. When the call ended, I remained at the kitchen counter with my phone in my hand. Across the room, Ellie was still fighting with the same math problem. She glanced up. You okay? I nodded. Yeah, that was enough for her. She went back to her homework. I stood there listening to the scratch of her pencil against paper and realized how different the moment felt from Christmas Day. When I had first contacted Nina, my mother's message was still glowing on my phone. Ellie's question was still fresh enough that I could hear it even in silence. Am I not family? That first call had contained anger. This one did not. The anger had done its job. It had forced me to stop explaining. Everything after that had required something harder. Looking. Dad had failed Ellie and admitted it. Heather had chosen convenience and eventually stopped hiding behind Mom's explanation. Greg had shown me how quickly family mattered once his own routines were threatened. Mom had finally sat across from Ellie and heard the difference between demanding everyone and needing one person. None of those things could be undone by keeping the house. And none of them would automatically be repaired by selling it. The offer simply made the decision irreversible. That hurt more than I expected. For months, the house had existed in an in-between state. I could imagine selling it without imagining strangers turning a key in the front door. Now, someone eventually would. I let that hurt, then put the phone down and helped Ellie with fractions. March 31st came on a cold, bright morning, and Mom and Dad moved quietly. Dad had spent weeks handling his part of the move. He hired movers for the large furniture, sorted boxes, dealt with utilities, and gradually reduced decades of accumulated belongings into what could fit inside the smaller place they had chosen. I had to resist the old impulse to solve every problem when Dad mentioned a changed mover window, limited storage, too many dishes, or Mom's indecision over decorations. This time I let him handle his own move. He did not perfectly, but without needing me to become the manager. Mom described the new place as exile at least twice that I heard about. It was not exile. It was a comfortable 2-bedroom condo with an elevator, a small balcony, reasonable costs, and less maintenance than the house they had been struggling to carry before I bought it. Dad liked the elevator, the absence of yard work, and the fact that the furnace was someone else's problem. Mom noticed the missing formal dining room, basement, extra guest space, and the impossibility of fitting her enormous Christmas tree. The first time I visited, I understood why she was grieving. The condo was perfectly fine, which was exactly why Mom's grief was so revealing. Nothing was wrong with the building. It simply could not perform the old house's role. People could visit, but they would have to choose to. Dad had arranged 2 chairs on the balcony, even though it was too cold to use them yet. Mom had already placed familiar photographs on a shelf. For one moment, seeing them there made my chest tighten. A picture of Ellie at 7, Heather's children, Greg's son, one of Ben holding Ellie when she was small. The photographs survived the move. That seemed important. The relationships had always been people. We had just spent years confusing them with rooms. Mom was cool with me during that visit. Not hostile. Not warm. She referred to the condo as temporary, even though everyone understood it was not. I did not correct her. Some truths did not need me to enforce them every hour. Dad walked me to my car afterward. He looked tired, but lighter in a way I could not quite describe. The old house had demanded more from him than he had admitted. Repairs, yard work, stairs, Mom's expectation that every gathering be maintained exactly as it had been. He had lost something too. But unlike Mom, he had begun making room for what came next. A few days later, after the house was empty and before the spring closing, I went back alone. I had expected the silence to feel peaceful. It did not. An empty house sounds larger than an occupied one. My footsteps echoed differently in the front hall. The rooms had pale rectangles on the walls where pictures had hung. Furniture legs had left impressions in the carpet. A faint line of dust marked where the dining room hutch had stood for years. The house looked familiar and foreign at the same time. I closed the front door behind me and stood beside the console, where my car keys had rested on December 20th. The ceramic Santa was gone. For 5 days, those keys had sat there while Ellie was in the hospital. On Christmas morning, they had still been close enough for anyone in that house to pick up. I did not need the image anymore. It no longer made me angry the way it once had. It simply belonged to the truth of what happened. I walked toward the staircase. Halfway up was the step that creaked. Ellie had mentioned it when I asked what she missed. I put my foot on it deliberately. It creaked. I laughed once, quietly. That small sound nearly broke me, because suddenly I was not 39 years old selling property. I was 12, coming downstairs too early on Christmas morning. I was 17, angry at Mom and trying to move silently past the living room. I was 25, bringing Ben home for a family dinner and watching him realize within 10 minutes that my mother could turn choosing a restaurant into a military operation. I reached the upper hallway. The bedroom that had once been mine was empty. There was a faint discoloration on one wall, where a bookshelf had stood for years. The closet seemed much smaller than I remembered. Everything from childhood does. I stood in the doorway and thought about the first weeks after Ben died. There had been evenings when I brought Ellie here, because being alone in my own house felt unbearable. Dad would sit with her. Mom would cook. For all the harm I now understood, they had also held us during a time when I could barely hold myself. That was real too. I did not need to erase it in order to leave. Downstairs, I walked into the kitchen. I could still picture Ellie on a stool with flour on her nose, while Mom taught her to make cookies. I could see Ben leaning against the counter, stealing pieces of dough while Mom pretended to be annoyed. I opened the back door and stepped onto the patio for a minute. The yard looked smaller without summer furniture or children in it. Along the fence, the grass was flattened where Dad had dragged trash bins for years. The corner that stayed muddy after rain was still muddy. Nothing had arranged itself into a perfect farewell. A neighbor's dog barked twice, a truck passed on the street behind the houses, and cold air slipped through the sleeves of my coat. I remembered Ellie running through that yard with Chloe, Ben standing near the grill pretending he knew what he was doing, Dad inflating a cheap pool that leaned to one side because the ground was never level. Back inside, I opened one kitchen cabinet out of habit and found it empty. The absence startled me more than the bare walls. I knew exactly what had lived there, mixing bowls stacked badly. Mom's measuring cups, the chipped mug Dad refused to throw away. The shelves smelled faintly of wood, and the lemon cleaner Mom had used for as long as I could remember. For years I had treated those ordinary details as proof the house itself contained the family. Standing there with the cabinet empty, I could finally feel the distinction without needing to explain it to myself. The objects were gone. The people who had used them were still alive, still making choices about one another. I moved into the dining room and stood near the place where Ben had usually sat. There was no chair there now, only an indentation in the carpet where furniture had rested. I could picture his hand around a glass, his head tipped back when he laughed, the way he would catch my eye across a crowded table when Mom became too much and make a face only I could see. Losing the room did not erase that exchange. The memory came with me because it belonged to me, not to the deed. I remembered one Christmas when he sat at the dining table laughing so hard at Greg that he knocked over his drink. Nothing in the kitchen offered a secret answer or message from Ben. There were only rooms, memories, and the decision I had already made. I rested my hand on the kitchen counter. For months, I had talked about the cost Mom was paying. Standing there, I finally allowed myself to name mine. I was selling my childhood home. I was losing the last place where Ben still seemed to occupy certain corners exactly as I remembered him. I was ending the possibility that Ellie would bring her own children there someday and tell them which stair squeaked. That loss was real, and the decision could still be right. Those two truths no longer frightened me when they existed together. Before leaving, I walked through each room once. Not ceremonially, just slowly. Then I locked the door behind me. The closing happened later that spring. Nina handled the process. I signed what was required. and the buyers became the owners. By then, the real consequences had begun long before the paperwork ended. Over the next several months, our family reorganized itself without anyone officially announcing that we were reorganizing. Heather hosted one cramped dinner where a child spilled something and nobody had enough serving spoons. Another time, the cousins met for pizza and a movie. Ellie sometimes saw Chloe with barely 5 minutes of adult conversation attached. Relationships that had once depended on one house began existing in different sizes. Greg struggled the most. Without Mom's house acting as free storage, gathering place, and backup parenting location, he had to reorganize parts of his life he had never considered family benefits until they disappeared. Greg put his boxes in a storage unit, complained about the cost, and rebuilt his routines with his son without an automatic stop at Mom's. He stayed resentful longer than Heather did. I stopped trying to convert him. His agreement was no longer required for me to trust my own decision. Dad behaved differently. Dad called Ellie in ordinary, unforced ways. He attended one school event and arrived before we did. The parking was terrible, and he never mentioned it. He brought no gift or speech, simply sat through the event and asked Ellie afterward which part she had liked best. Months earlier, I would have called that normal grandfather behavior. After Christmas, ordinary reliability was exactly what repair required. Heather did something similar in her own way. She respected Ellie's no. If she suggested a cousin outing and Ellie was tired or had other plans, Heather did not treat the refusal as rejection. She did not use Chloe to pressure her. She did not tell Mom every detail. Most importantly, she never presented Ellie's willingness to see the cousins as proof that everything was fixed. Nothing was magically fixed. Some things were simply being rebuilt. My relationship with Heather remained cautious. We had not magically become best friends, because we both saw Mom more clearly. Sometimes I still remembered Christmas and felt the distance between what Heather could have done and what she chose. Sometimes she became defensive if the subject came too close to that morning, but she had stopped asking me to erase it. That mattered. Mom's path was slower. After the meeting with Ellie, she made occasional efforts. Some were good. A short message without guilt. A birthday card that did not contain a lecture. One phone call where she asked Ellie about school and did not turn the conversation into a request for a visit. Other times the old pattern returned. She suggested that enough time had passed. She acted surprised that she was not automatically included in something. Once she told me children should not be allowed to control adult relationships. I agreed. Then I reminded her that Ellie was controlling only her own participation. Mom did not like that distinction, but she could no longer overrule it. Her relationship with Ellie remained distant, not dead, not restored. Simply honest about how much trust still had to be earned. By autumn, I noticed something else. Nobody had replaced the old family house. There was no new command center. Heather hosted sometimes. Dad and Mom had people over individually in the condo, though Mom could not fit everyone even if she wanted to. Greg handled his own holidays with his son. I hosted when I wanted to. People moved between houses. Without a central house, family became less convenient and more intentional. Dad came when he wanted to see Ellie. Heather asked when she wanted the cousins together. Greg had to name his needs, instead of assuming Mom's house would absorb them. Some relationships scattered, others chose to come closer. The family had not disappeared. It had become a network instead of a hierarchy. I used to think keeping the peace meant keeping everyone together. I learned that sometimes peace is what arrives after you stop forcing the wrong people to stay close. That did not mean the people I loved were permanently discarded. It meant closeness could no longer be forced for appearance. It had to fit behavior and leave room for no. By the time Christmas came again, I was 40. Ellie was 12. A full year had passed since the hospital lobby. I thought I would feel that anniversary approaching like a storm. Instead, Christmas arrived through ordinary things. A grocery list, tangled lights, and Ellie arguing for 3 desserts. My house was much smaller than Mom's old one, and the kitchen became crowded with only a few people inside it. For the first time, that did not feel like failure. Dottie arrived before noon carrying what she called one thing. The one thing consisted of several bags and a casserole dish balanced dangerously on top. She was already talking before I opened the door completely. She complained that my front step was too narrow for a person carrying food, despite having used the same step many times. Ellie appeared behind me and started laughing. Dottie informed her that laughing did not make the architecture safer. Heather came later with the kids. They stayed for part of the day, and that was enough. Chloe and Ellie disappeared with their phones, returned for food, argued about something meaningless, and disappeared again. Dad came too. He had earned the invitation not through one apology, but through months of small, boring reliability. He arrived when he said he would. He brought no grand gesture. He helped clear plates because that was what he had always done. Mom was not there because Ellie was not ready for that relationship at Christmas. Dad and Heather respected the answer. Mom did not like it, but dislike was no longer a veto. The day was imperfect. The rolls browned too quickly. Dottie insisted my kitchen was designed for people who hated counter space. Heather forgot something she had promised to bring. One of the kids complained about a present. Dad fell asleep for 20 minutes in a chair. Nobody took a perfect family photograph. At one point, I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room and watched everyone move around one another. For years, I would have counted who was missing Mom's empty chair, Greg's absence, the smaller table, the broken traditions. This time, I noticed that everyone present had chosen to come, and Ellie was comfortable having them there. Dottie was complaining about where I kept serving spoons when Ellie picked up a chair and moved it closer to the table. She did not ask whose place it was, or whether there was room. She simply put the chair where she wanted it and sat down. I watched her reach across the table for a roll, while Chloe said something that made her laugh. That was when I finally understood what I had been trying to give her all those years after Ben died. I had once thought safety meant making sure Ellie never lost another person. I could not promise that. People leave, fail, die, disappoint us, and sometimes repair what they broke. What I could give her was smaller and stronger. A home where she never had to earn her place by being easy, and a family where titles did not excuse behavior. The house was smaller than the one I had spent years trying to keep at the center of our family. But that Christmas, for the first time, my daughter never had to ask whether there was room for her.